close your eyes for a moment. Settle in. Imagine the sky above ancient Thebes, the air thick with the scent of olive groves, heat clinging to stones like a second skin. Below, in the shaded palace courtyard, a young woman fans herself, her eyes flickering now and then toward the horizon. She is waiting, not for a suitor, not for a servant, but for something far more divine and far more dangerous. Her name is Semele, daughter of Cadmus, the founder of Thebes. Her family tree is already a tangle of myths and monsters. Cadmus himself is said to have slain a dragon and sowed its teeth into the earth, from which warriors sprouted like weeds. But Semele, she was no warrior. She was a priestess of Zeus, or so some say, and perhaps that explains everything, or nothing at all. What matters is that Zeus noticed her, and as the myths go, that usually ends badly. Zeus, king of the gods, had a habit, one might say a rather irresponsible hobby, of falling in love with mortal women. He was married to Hera, of course, but fidelity was never his strong suit. When Zeus turned his eye on Semele, he disguised himself as a mortal man, handsome and charming, and began visiting her in secret. Night after night, they met in the shadows of her chamber, their conversations whispered, their hands entwined. But secrets, in Olympus or on Earth, never stay secret for long. Hera found out. She always did. But this time, she didn't send serpents or thunderbolts. No, Hera was far too clever for that. Instead, she transformed herself into an old woman and paid a visit to the young princess. "You say you're in love," the old woman cooed. "But are you certain it is really Zeus?" Semele, like many mortals tangled with gods, was confident in what she knew, and yet the seed of doubt had been planted. What if it wasn't Zeus? What if she was being deceived by some cunning imposter? Her pride, her curiosity, and perhaps something deeper, the need for validation took root. The next time Zeus came to her bedchamber, Semele made a request. "Show me your true form," she whispered. "Swear on the river Styx that you will grant me one wish." Now, the river Styx is not to be taken lightly. An oath sworn on it is binding, even to gods. Zeus agreed, not knowing what she would ask. "Reveal yourself to me," she said. And in that moment, the king of gods knew tragedy had already unfolded. You see, mortals cannot look upon a god in their full divine form. The power, the radiance, it is too much. Zeus begged her to change her mind. He warned her, pleaded with her, but she refused. A promise is a promise. So reluctantly, Zeus revealed himself. What Semele saw was not the man who had courted her, but a blazing storm of light and fire, crowned with lightning. His voice became thunder, his presence overwhelming, and in a flash, she was gone, burned to ash by divine brilliance. But this is not the end of the story. It is, quite curiously, a beginning, because Semele was pregnant, and in the split second before her body was destroyed, Zeus reached into the flames and pulled the unborn child from her womb. There are few tales in mythology as bizarre or as oddly touching as what happened next. With nowhere else to place the infant, Zeus did what few would expect. He sewed the baby into his own thigh. Yes, into his thigh. Why the thigh? Scholars have debated this. Some say it was a metaphor for rebirth, others for sacrifice. Perhaps it was simply the safest place available. Regardless, the child gestated inside Zeus himself until the day he was ready to be born. And thus, Dionysus was born, twice born, in fact once from Semele, and again from the flesh of Olympus's most powerful god. A strange entrance into the world, wouldn't you say? But it gets stranger. Zeus knew the child would never be safe from Hera's jealousy, so he did what any overprotective father might do. He disguised the baby as a girl and hid him away in the care of mountain nymphs. They raised him in secret, among ivy and wild animals, far from the prying eyes of Olympus. Here in the wilderness, Dionysus learned the rhythms of the earth. He played among vines, laughed with satyrs, and drank the dew from grape leaves. The boy grew wild and beautiful, but he also grew curious about who he was and why he had to hide. And as he grew, so too did the whispers of his power. He was unlike the other gods. He didn't command thunder or oceans. He didn't rule over war or harvest. Instead, Dionysus stirred something different in the hearts of mortals: ecstasy, abandon, transformation. He would one day become the god of wine. Yes, but not just wine. Of chaos and celebration, of masks and madness, of joy that teetered on the edge of danger. But we're not there yet. Right now, Dionysus is still a child in hiding. The world does not yet know his name. So what makes this strange birth matter? Why begin the mythic saga here, with fire and thighs and whispered jealousy? Because this story, unlike so many others in Greek mythology, starts not with triumph or vengeance, but with vulnerability. A mortal woman dared to love a god, and in the process she died. But her son, her half-divine son, survived, not by war, not by conquest, but by being rescued, protected, hidden. And that perhaps is what makes Dionysus different from the others. He is not born into a throne, he is born into exile. And from that exile, a revolution will rise. But before we reach that part, before the tiger rides and the frenzied parties, we must understand what it means to be born twice and to live in a world that doesn't yet have a name for what you are. So let us pause here, in the quiet shadow of the mountains, where ivy curls around tree trunks and baby Dionysus dreams beneath a veil of stars. How does a child hidden from the world grow into a god who breaks all boundaries? The forest, they say, remembers everything. When Dionysus was a child, hidden among the wooded slopes of Mount Nysa, there were no temples carved in his honor, no golden goblets raised to toast his name. He was not yet the god of wine or revelry or divine madness. He was simply a boy with golden curls, wrapped in a veil of ivy, cradled by nymphs who spoke in song and knew the secret names of trees. His caretakers, the Hyades and the Maenads, were not human. These mountain nymphs were part of the natural world in a way no mortal ever could be. They whispered with the wind, danced with streams, and told stories to the stars as if they were old friends. And to Dionysus, they were mother, sister, and teacher, all at once. Here, the boy learned softness before power. They taught him to walk by moonlight, barefoot on moss, to coax grapes from vines with patience, not force, to listen to the silence between birdsong, to know that magic was not a spell cast with words, but something already humming in every root and stone. But not even this wild haven could remain untouched forever. Hera had not forgotten. The wife of Zeus, ever watchful, ever wounded, learned that her husband's mortal affair had borne fruit, a child, a boy, and worse, a boy who might one day be worshipped. This would not do. So Hera set out to destroy him, but not with swords or serpents, not yet. She worked through dreams, delusions, and madness. Some say she sent madness directly into his mind. Others claim she whispered it into the ears of those who cared for him, turning their love to confusion. Whatever the case, something shifted. One morning, the boy awoke to find the forest no longer felt like home. The birds no longer sang for him. The ivy clung too tightly to his limbs. The laughter of the nymphs echoed with unease. And so, driven by a force he couldn't name, Dionysus fled. He wandered, first through the thick forests of Phrygia, then over the rocky paths of Lydia. He slept beneath fig trees. He drank rainwater cupped in leaves. And all the while, something in him was changing. He had known love. Now he learned solitude. Wherever he went, people felt unsettled. A beautiful stranger, with a crown of grape leaves and a gaze that seemed to shimmer. He brought joy, but it was the kind of joy that arrived too quickly and stayed too long. He made people laugh, then weep, dance, then collapse. It wasn't just wine, it was a letting go, a crack in the mask. You see, Dionysus did not offer comfort, he offered release, and it frightened people. In Thrace, he tried to settle, just for a little while, but the king, Lycurgus, feared him. A boy like this, with strange powers and stranger followers, was a threat, so Lycurgus tried to imprison Dionysus, to bind him in chains of iron. But the chains melted, and the land itself rebelled. Thorns burst from the earth, vines crept into the palace, and madness took the king. He raved and thrashed, and struck down his own son, mistaking him for an enemy. When the land had calmed, Dionysus was gone again, always wandering, always searching, for what, even he did not know. In another version of the tale, he sails to Egypt. There, he studies secret rites, learns the magic of fermentation, of transformation, how grapes, left to rot, could become ecstasy, and how that ecstasy could unshackle the mind. Wine was not just drink, it was revelation, disruption, a passageway between worlds. But still, Dionysus could not stay. He kept moving, through Arabia, Persia, India. Everywhere he went, he left behind small cults, bands of women who tore through the woods, crowned in ivy, singing his name, men who left their plows to beat drums under moonlight, slaves who danced with kings, and kings who woke screaming, unsure of what had happened the night before. The rituals began to take shape. Masks, music, movement, wine, rebirth. They would become the foundation of the Dionysian mysteries, secret rites that promise something deeper than logic, a touch of the divine through surrender. And yet, Dionysus remained on the outside of Olympus, neither mortal nor fully god, born of flame and thigh and hidden breast milk, a wanderer, a stranger, a twice-born orphan. In his travels, he began to gather a retinue, a curious collection of misfits and spirits, satyrs with goat legs and mischievous grins, maenads with wild hair and louder voices, Pan, the horned god of the wild, Silenus, an old drunkard who may or may not have been wise, tigers, leopards, lions, creatures of instinct and chaos. They did not worship him, they followed him. They were not bound by order, they were bound by energy. Together, they were like a storm with flutes and bare feet. Wherever they went, the world shifted, just a little. Rules unraveled, masks slipped, people remembered how to howl. But all this time, Dionysus longed for something else, something quieter, something older, a place to belong. One day, he stood beneath the shadow of Olympus and looked up. The other gods had thrones, temples, myths. He had only memories, a burning mother, a stitched thigh, a hidden childhood, and a world that either feared him or forgot him. So he made a decision. It was time to return, time to climb the mountain, time to take what had been denied. But Olympus was not easily impressed. Even gods must prove themselves. And so Dionysus prepared to show the Olympians what it meant to truly lose control. He would not bring armies. He would not bring thunder. He would bring something far more unsettling. Joy without permission, freedom without structure, madness without shame, a festival that never ended, a party that shook the heavens. But before he could reach the top, there was one more story he needed to settle. One mortal city, still laughing behind closed doors. Thebes, his mother's city, the city that never believed her story, the city that whispered liar as she burned. Dionysus was going home, and this time, he would not be hidden. But how do you convince a city to believe in a god it mocked? What happens when joy itself knocks on your palace door? When Dionysus returned to Thebes, it was not with quiet footsteps or a whisper of wind. It was with music. Pipes, drums, and laughter echoed from the hills. Ivy bloomed overnight on temple walls. The smell of fermenting grapes clung to the air, and the women, the mothers, daughters and wives of Thebes, left their homes. They left their looms and water jars, their babies and their husbands. They walked out in silence and vanished into the woods, to dance, to scream, to become something else. The king of Thebes, Pentheus, sat on his throne with a frown. His city, the proud home of warriors and kings, was turning into a playground for chaos. He had heard rumors of a strange man with long hair, soft features, and a silver tongue, a man who called himself a god, a man who inspired women to tear animals apart with their bare hands, a man who brought madness in the guise of joy, a man claiming to be the son of Semele. It was an insult. Pentheus had never believed the stories about his aunt. He'd called them lies, excuses for shame, the ravings of a girl too eager for attention. And now, years later, here was this so-called god stirring up unrest. No, this would not stand. He ordered the stranger arrested. Dionysus, wearing a mortal disguise, as he often did, went willingly, calm, smiling, almost amused. They bound his hands, though no rope held him. They questioned him. He answered in riddles. When asked who he was, he replied, "I am the joy that trembles before dawn. I am the silence that sings." The guards laughed. The king did not. He locked Dionysus in the palace prison, and then the walls began to breathe. Ivy crept through the cracks. Wine bubbled up from the floor. Flames danced but did not burn. And the god, still smiling, stepped free from his cell as if it were made of mist. The next day, Dionysus stood again before Pentheus, this time without shackles. The king, increasingly rattled, refused to see the signs. He called the god a fraud, a foreigner, a poison. He would go to the hills himself, he declared. He would spy on the women, see what wickedness they were up to. He would punish them. He would restore order. Dionysus offered to help. He dressed the king in a long flowing robe, draped his hair in curls, painted his eyes, gave him a staff. A disguise, he said, lips twitching. Pentheus, swept up in a haze, accepted. They climbed the mountain together, and there, among the vines and rocks, the king of Thebes crept like a thief. He peered through the brush at the maenads, the wild women of Dionysus, dancing with abandon, their eyes glowing, their feet bare, their joy unchained. And then they saw him. What happened next was not gentle. The The women, overcome by divine frenzy, mistook Pentheus for a lion, or a spy, or simply a threat. They descended on him, not with weapons, but with hands, and among them was Agave, his mother. She too did not see her son, only a beast. She led the others in the tearing. When it was done, she held his head aloft like a trophy, laughing with blood-smeared teeth. She would not realize her mistake until the madness faded, until the wine soured in her throat. By then, it was too late. The city wept. But Dionysus did not. This was not vengeance. This was justice. Thebes had denied his mother, denied him, denied the truth. Now they had felt it, raw, uncontrollable, and divine. And so Dionysus walked from the smoking ruins of belief and turned his gaze to Olympus. His rights were established. His myths had teeth. His name was known. The other gods, whether from awe or fear, welcomed him at last. They gave him a throne among the 12, not because he fit their mold, but because he broke it. You see, Dionysus was never meant to be a god of order. He is the god of what slips through, of what cannot be contained. He is the part of you that wants to dance barefoot under stars, even when you're expected to sit still. The part that cries during music you can't explain. The laugh that bubbles up at funerals. The moment when the mask slips and you feel more real than ever before. And perhaps that's why he rode a tiger, not a chariot. Why he wore a crown of vines, not gold. Why his followers were misfits, not warriors. Because Dionysus was not born from power. He was born from loss. He was not raised in palaces, but in wilderness. And he did not demand worship. He invited it with a smile and a cup of wine. Even now, when the world feels too still, too strict, too sharp, listen closely. You might hear pipes in the distance, or laughter that makes your skin tingle, or ivy creeping up stone that no gardener planted. And in that moment, know this: the god of joyful chaos never left. He's just waiting for you to let go, just a little, so you too can be born again. As the echoes of that story fade, let us drift into the next curious hour. The forgotten builders, how the Cyclopes lost their jobs. Take a deep breath. Let the world fall away. Let your thoughts drift, not to the polished marble temples of Athens or the echoing chants of Delphi, but to the underground shadows of the ancient world, to a place where the air is thick with smoke and iron, and the walls hum with the low, steady beat of hammers against stone. This is not Olympus. This is the forge beneath it. And here, long before the gods built their thrones, 3 brothers toiled in the dark: Brontes, Steropes, and Arges, the Cyclopes. No, not the man-eating giants from Homer's Odyssey. Those came later, muddled and monstrous in tales passed down through fear. These Cyclopes were older, stranger, divine. Their names meant thunderer, lightning, and bright. And they had one eye, not as a deformity, but as a symbol, a radiant eye that saw not just light, but the truth of what lay beneath form. They were craftsmen, makers, inventors before invention had a name. When the world was still raw and titans ruled the sky, the Cyclopes lived in Tartarus, deep beneath the earth, prisoners of Kronos. Why were they imprisoned? Some say he feared their gifts, others that he hated anything he could not control. In either case, the Cyclopes were shackled in the dark, their hammers silenced, their sparks extinguished, until Zeus came, a young god with a storm in his belly, seeking allies in a war that had no end in sight. The Titanomachy, 10 years of divine warfare, of mountains shattered and oceans boiled, needed more than muscle. It needed tools, so Zeus descended into Tartarus and freed the Cyclopes, and in return, they forged him a gift: thunder, lightning, a bolt that crackled with pure chaos, honed in fire and cooled in the breath of night. To Poseidon, they gave the trident, 3-pronged, forged in pressure and salt, capable of shaking the seas. To Hades, the helm of invisibility, woven from the shadow skin of the underworld itself. With these gifts, the young gods triumphed, the titans fell, a new order rose, Olympus was born, and the Cyclopes, they returned to their forges. They worked in smoke and silence. They did not ask for thrones. They did not demand temples. They built, day after day, year after year. They carved chariots from bronze and wheels from obsidian. They made armor for Athena, shields for Ares, even tiny mechanical birds that sang in Apollo's garden. Hephaestus, the lame god of fire, often worked beside them, but even he admitted the Cyclopes knew things he never could, and yet their names faded. Their forges, once the heart of Olympus's strength, grew quiet. Why? What happens when even gods forget the hands that built their power? Some say the Cyclopes were too strange, too silent, too other. They didn't feast with the gods. They didn't scheme or seduce. They had no dramas, no myths, no scandals. They had work, and that, perhaps, is why they were forgotten. Because history remembers heroes, not craftsmen. But look closely, trace the edges of every mythic weapon, every divine tool, and somewhere beneath the golden glory, you'll find the Cyclops' touch. Still, their time was ending. Even gods grow bored of those who stay in the background. One day, they were summoned, not to build, but to warn. Apollo had killed a serpent, Python, at Delphi, claiming the sacred oracle for himself. But in doing so, he broke the divine order. Zeus, angered, demanded punishment. The Cyclopes whispered, build restraint, channel the gift of prophecy, don't dominate it. Apollo refused. The gods no longer listened to the builders. So the Cyclopes returned to their forge, only to face another betrayal. Zeus, in a moment of fury, struck them down. Why? That tale is murky. Some say it was revenge for the death of his son, Asclepius, struck by a thunderbolt. Others whisper that Zeus feared the Cyclopes would turn their forging to rebellion. Whatever the reason, the god of thunder destroyed the very hands that had given him lightning. Their hammers fell silent. The forges grew cold, and the one-eyed brothers faded into ash. But can divine craftsmen truly die? Later myths claimed they returned, working in secret for Hephaestus, hidden in volcanoes, building automata, and casting stars. Others said they fled to Sicily, where their descendants, wilder, more brutal, would one day menace sailors like Odysseus. But those were not these Cyclopes. These were the first ones, the forgotten ones, and perhaps the most tragic. Not because they failed, but because they succeeded so well that the world no longer noticed. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, think not of gods on thrones or warriors with swords. Think of a forge in the dark, a steady rhythm of hammer on metal. Three brothers, one eye each, watching the sparks rise like stars. They were never worshipped, they were never loved, but they built everything the gods ever held dear. What becomes of power when its creators are erased from memory? Far from Olympus, past the sculpted clouds and marble halls, past even the ringing echoes of mortal prayers, there lies an island where the earth smokes from within. Its name is Sicily, and nestled inside its churning volcanoes, some say the Cyclopes still breathe, but they are not the same. These are not the bright-eyed builders of thunderbolts and divine tools. These are shadows of that lineage, gruffer, wilder, often confused with the later mythic monsters who threw rocks at ships and ate sheep raw. Still, the stories blur. And sometimes, if you listen between the lines of myth, you can hear the whispers of something older. After their banishment, after Zeus silenced their forges and struck them from memory, the original Cyclopes were not dead exactly, not in the way mortals die. They were divine. Creation itself hummed in their veins. You cannot so easily undo beings who shaped the very weapons of the gods. Instead, they withdrew, deep into the belly of the earth, and there they built again. But this time, not for Olympus, not for war, for themselves. Volcanoes became their temples, steam their breath, lava their forge. The rhythmic thump of eruption became their new hymn, a heartbeat that reminded them they were still here, still working, even if no one asked anymore. It was in this exile that their creations became stranger. They no longer needed to make weapons or regale ornaments. They were free, free to build what they dreamed, and their dreams were wild. The first known automaton, legend says, came from these hidden workshops. Talus, a giant of bronze who patrolled the shores of Crete, circling the island thrice each day to guard it from invaders. He had no flesh, no hunger, no sleep. In his veins flowed ichor, the golden blood of the gods, powered by a single bronze nail in his ankle. He was not a soldier, he was a sentinel, a protector, a creation built not for conquest, but for constancy. And behind that design, some whisper, was the hand of a Cyclops. Others followed, mechanical birds that sang lullabies to nymphs, spiders made of gold that wove nets between trees, tiny lions that could roar even without lungs, things not meant for battle, things made, perhaps just for wonder. And for the first time, the Cyclops began to craft for themselves. They built intricate cities inside the volcanoes, hidden labyrinths where metal vines twisted like ivy, and glowing crystals hummed with stored energy. These were not places of war, they were experiments in beauty. But Olympus was not blind forever. Hephaestus, the smith god, began to hear rumors of gears that moved without touch, of machines that dreamed, of fire that did not consume. So he traveled to Sicily. And what he found astonished him. The Cyclops had surpassed even their old work. They had gone beyond weapons and armor. They were making life, or something close to it. Hephaestus asked to join them, and the Cyclops, wordless, solemn, let him in. For a time they worked together. Hephaestus learned the rhythms of their silent craftsmanship, the way they communicated through gesture, through shared breath and sparks. The Cyclops, in turn, watched as Hephaestus blended art and utility, beauty and precision. Together, they built wonders. But again, Olympus grew uneasy. What did it mean, they asked, for gods to rely on builders who no longer needed them, for tools to become creators? And so quietly, the myths changed. The Cyclops were rewritten, no longer divine craftsmen. Now they were lumbering brutes, cannibals, shepherds who lived in caves and threw boulders. Odysseus, clever and charming, would later blind one of them, Polyphemus, a one-eyed giant who trapped sailors and wept for a lost love. That version stuck. The old Cyclops were forgotten, their forges silenced not by death, but by storytelling. Because history, as you know, is not just made by who wins, it's made by who tells the tale. And Olympus told theirs very well. But sometimes, the earth remembers, when Etna rumbles, when a furnace hisses, when metal sings before it melts. That's when you might feel them still. Brontes, Steropes, Arges, the builders of the storm, still forging, still dreaming, not for kings, not for gods, just because the spark still lives in their hands. So what does it mean that the most powerful gods in myth were armed not by themselves, but by quiet, unseen hands? And if creation outlives the creator, does that not make the creator immortal? Imagine, if you will, standing at the edge of Mount Etna. It is late evening, the sun is dipping low, and the air hums with warmth from beneath your feet. There is a faint tremble in the ground, not a quake, not a threat, just a pulse, like a forge sighing in its sleep. If you listen closely, you might think you hear it, the slow, steady rhythm of hammers deep underground. The Cyclopes are long gone, the myths will tell you. But something still beats beneath the stone. This is the paradox of the Cyclopes. They are forgotten, but never erased. After their withdrawal from Olympus, their fate splintered across tales like iron filings scattered across stone. One version claimed they continued serving Hephaestus, aiding him from inside the volcano, forging divine artifacts whenever Olympus required them. Quietly, without praise, tools in a workshop they built. Another said they faded into the underworld, choosing self-exile rather than serve a pantheon that discarded them. Still others whispered of their transformation, not death but dissolution. That the Cyclopes did not vanish, but became the molten heart of volcanoes, their breath the sulfur vents, their blood the lava, their sighs the hot winds that rattle mountain trees. But legacy is rarely linear in myth. The more useful a creation, the less likely its maker is remembered. Think of the thunderbolt. Every statue of Zeus shows him wielding it, but not one shrine honors the Cyclops who forged it. And yet, they are everywhere. Their work endures in echoes, in the notion that behind every god is a tool, behind every tool a hand, and behind that hand, a mind that imagines something new. Take Talos, the bronze giant who guarded Crete. Later myths said he fell to a trick, a nail removed, a slow loss of golden ichor, but the story rarely mentions the mind that shaped him, the ingenuity it required to build something that could move, think, protect. Talos may have fallen, but he became a blueprint. Centuries later, echoes of him would live in clockwork toys of Alexandria, in water-powered birds, in automatons designed by Heron, and even now in the hum of your devices, in the rhythm of machinery, you can find the ghost of a Cyclops spark. Creation persists even when the creator is forgotten. There's a quiet dignity in that. You see, the Cyclops didn't need temples. Their worship came from function, their devotion from precision. While others drank ambrosia and feasted in clouds, they hammered glowing metal in the dark, turning raw chaos into shape. That perhaps is their true power, to take the wildness of the universe and tame it, not through domination, but through design. And yet, they were feared, not because they threatened Olympus, but because they made Olympus possible. And what is more dangerous than the one who makes the powerful powerful? This fear birthed their erasure. First, their names vanished from the mouths of poets, then their deeds became footnotes, then the myths rewrote them as beasts. Cyclops became monsters, symbols of barbarism, obstacles for heroes. The The single eye, once a mark of divine sight, became a grotesque blemish. Their silence, once wisdom, became stupidity. Their strength, once creative, became violent. And just like that, the builders of the gods became myths that children feared. But myth is a strange creature. It forgets and remembers in cycles. In the Renaissance, scholars digging through forgotten texts stumbled upon the earlier Cyclops, Brontes, Steropes, Arges, divine artisans, lost creators. Their curiosity stirred questions. Who really made the tools of the gods? In modern times, archaeologists found ancient forges in Sicily, carved deep into the rock, with tunnels that spiraled like a labyrinth. Were these the haunts of later Cyclops, or remnants of stories older than Greece itself? We may never know, but what we do know is this: wherever there is fire, there is memory, and in every act of creation, a quiet echo of those who came first. So next time you pick up something crafted, something functional and beautiful, something that fits your hand like it always belonged there, pause, think of the Cyclops, not as monsters, not even as gods, but as makers, minds with calloused hands who built in the shadows, not for glory, but because the world needed building. They remind us of something gently profound. You don't need to be seen to matter. You don't need a throne to shape the world. Sometimes, all it takes is fire, focus, and the courage to keep forging, even when no one remembers your name. And in the soft glow of lava, or the sparks of steel, they're still there, watching, working, waiting. Let your breath settle. Let the stillness rise. Picture the Nile just before dawn, its waters dark and glassy, its banks wrapped in morning fog like a sleeping shore. Along the shore, reeds sway gently in the breeze, and distant ibis cry somewhere in the papyrus thickets. Now look further, across the river, past the fishermen hauling nets, to the white stone city of Waset, known to you as Thebes. Within its palatial walls, a girl stirs in silk sheets, her fingers already used to the weight of gold rings. Her name is Hatshepsut. She is a daughter of Pharaoh Thutmose I, the fourth pharaoh of Egypt's 18th dynasty. But this is not a story of power gained by sword or prophecy. This is a story of strategy, architecture, and a borrowed beard. Hatshepsut's world is steeped in ritual. She rises to prayers sung by priestesses, eats honeyed bread beside carved lions, and receives lessons in etiquette, history, and diplomacy. She is a princess, yes, but not just a royal ornament. From the beginning, she is different. You might say it's the blood in her veins. Her father Thutmose I declared her to be born of the god Amun himself, a claim often made by Egyptian rulers, but seldom repeated with such conviction. The story went like this. Amun visited her mother in the form of the pharaoh, placing divine breath in her womb. It's the sort of tale that sounds absurd to modern ears, but in ancient Egypt, it wasn't meant to be literal, it was meant to be legal, sacred. It meant Hatshepsut had not just royal right, but divine right. And yet the laws of Egypt did not welcome women as kings. They could rule behind a sun. They could act as regents, even as priestesses of great temples. But Pharaoh, no. Still, that future was not yet on the table. For now Hatshepsut was married off to her half-brother, Thutmose II, a common practice meant to keep the royal bloodline pure and unbroken. He was weak in health, mild in spirit. She was not. Some say she was the power behind the throne even then. But soon everything shifted. Thutmose II died young, leaving behind a son, not hers, but born of a concubine. The boy Thutmose III was too young to rule, a toddler, barely speaking. And so, as had happened before in Egyptian dynasties, a royal woman stepped in to hold the throne until the boy was of age. Hatshepsut became regent. It was supposed to be temporary, but years passed, the boy grew. And yet she did not step aside. Instead, she stepped forward. At first quietly, then more boldly, she began appearing in official reliefs, not as queen or mother figure, but as pharaoh, wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, wielding the crook and flail, and most famously, wearing the ceremonial false beard of kingship, a chinstrap of authority woven from tradition. This, of course, caused murmurs. A woman as pharaoh. It had happened only once or twice in Egypt's vast history, and never quite like this. Hatshepsut was not ruling in crisis. The land was not in chaos. She was not a stopgap. She was a deliberate king. But she didn't seize power through force. There were no battles, no assassinations, no palace coups. Instead, she built monuments, obelisks, Temples, stories. She commissioned a vast mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, nestled against the cliffs of western Thebes, a masterpiece of harmony and symmetry, its terraces stacked like sacred steps to the sky. It told the story she wanted remembered, not just of her reign, but of her birth, divine and destined. Reliefs inside showed the god Amun, selecting her as ruler, long before her human form had even taken shape. She understood something vital about history. It is made not only by action, but by architecture. The walls that last are the ones people read centuries later. But how did she hold on? How did she rule, year after year, as a woman in a world of male kings? It wasn't because she pretended to be a man. Not really. In carvings, yes, she was shown with broad shoulders and the beard of pharaohs. But her name was not hidden, her lineage not rewritten. She ruled not as a man, but as a king. And in Egypt, that meant something more sacred than simply gender. Pharaoh was not just a ruler. Pharaoh was a divine function, a cosmic stabilizer. And Hatshepsut filled that role with competence that was frankly dull. No great wars, no calamities. Trade missions were launched, grain stores grew, temples were maintained, the land prospered. Her most famous expedition was to the land of Punt, a mysterious kingdom possibly located in modern Eritrea or Somalia. Egyptian ships sailed down the Red Sea, returning months later with gold, ebony, exotic animals, incense trees, and on the walls of her temple, she had it all recorded, not just the goods, but the journey itself. Sailors hauling ropes, trees being planted, incense harvested. It was not the glory of conquest, it was the glory of order, a kind of quiet triumph. But not everyone celebrated. There were those who waited, who watched. The boy king she had once protected was now a man, and in him, a storm was gathering. Still, Hatshepsut ruled on. 2 decades passed. She had outlasted doubt, but power built slowly has a strange fragility to it, because when it cracks, it disappears almost completely, and that, perhaps, is what makes her story so haunting. How does a woman reign for 20 years with strength and dignity, only to be all but erased from history? That answer lies not just in her death, but in the strange things that happened after, and it begins with a name. The air in Thebes hangs heavier now. Decades have passed. Hatshepsut, once the living goddess of the 2 lands, is gone. Her death is quiet. No drama, no collapse of empire, no rebellion in the streets. She simply fades, as all mortals must, her body entombed beneath the western cliffs, her temple watching the desert winds. But in the years that follow, something strange begins. Her name, so carefully carved in stone, painted in lapis, etched beside gods, is chipped away, literally, one by one. Her cartouches are chiseled off monuments, her statues smashed or hidden. In some places, her images are replaced with those of Thutmose III, now grown, now pharaoh in full. It is not a frenzy of destruction, but a quiet, meticulous erasure. What could cause such surgical forgetting? Thutmose III had waited decades in the wings, growing up not on a throne, but in the long shadow of a woman ruling in his place. Some scholars believe he harbored resentment, not simply because she ruled, but because she ruled well. There was no rebellion to exploit, no failure to highlight. Her reign had been one of prosperity, trade, and monumental achievement. How do you claim superiority over someone who gave your country 20 years of stability? One way is to pretend it never happened, and so a campaign of removal began. Not in year 1 of his reign, but much later, almost as if he waited until the memory of her face had begun to fade from public view, as if he knew that to fully secure his legacy, hers had to dissolve. So stonecutters went to work. At Karnak, her obelisks were walled off, too large to remove, too sacred to destroy, but they were hidden, buried in plain sight. At Deir el-Bahari, her name was erased from temple walls. In some reliefs, the figures were clumsily altered to resemble males. Other places were simply plastered over. It was a peculiar kind of revenge, not violent, not immediate, but a slow silencing. And yet it didn't quite work, because Hatshepsut, meticulous as ever, had written herself into too many places. Her statues, though shattered, were buried rather than discarded. Her temple, though defaced, remained too magnificent to ignore. Even in the shadows of later pharaohs, the shape of her story endured. Still, for nearly 3,000 years, her name was absent from history. Her existence passed into whispers, then into silence, until the 19th century, when European archaeologists picking through the sands of Thebes, began to uncover anomalies, statues of a pharaoh, with feminine features, inscriptions that didn't quite align with the official king lists, and finally, the temple at Deir el-Bahari, partially buried, wind-worn but unmistakably majestic. On its walls, reliefs showing a divine birth, an expedition to Punt, and a female king standing beside the gods. It took decades of scholarship, piecing together fragments like a broken mirror, but eventually the truth was rediscovered. Hatshepsut had ruled, brilliantly, quietly, strategically. She had taken the reins of an empire and steered it without war or chaos. She had proven that power need not shout. That legacy can be written in limestone and shaded terraces, and that sometimes the slowest ruler is the hardest to defeat. But what makes Hatshepsut so remarkable isn't just that she ruled, it's how she ruled. She didn't reject the system, she worked within it, subtly twisting its logic until it bent. She wore the beard, yes, but she made it hers. She obeyed the rituals, yes, but she rewrote their meaning. She didn't demand new myths, she inserted herself into the old ones, like ivy curling around ancient stone, altering the pattern just enough. And that's the quiet genius of her reign. Where others conquered by sword, she conquered by symbol, and long after her name was scratched from every temple wall, her structures still stood, enduring, unbending, watching. But what does it mean to lead in silence? To build a legacy not through force but through design? To accept invisibility in your own time, knowing that history might one day look again? Sleep does not come easy to stone. It holds memory long after voices fall silent, after footsteps fade from corridors, after the sun itself forgets how often it once warmed those walls. So it is with the temple at Deir el-Bahari. When the world turned away from Hatshepsut, her monuments did not. Her temple, carved directly into the cliffs above the Valley of the Kings, stood waiting through centuries of sandstorms, earthquakes, and erasure. A kind of patient witness. And when 19th century archaeologists arrived, some with shovels, some with skepticism, they found her there, still, faint outlines of her face in chipped reliefs, forgotten cartouches, preserved in shadowed alcoves, walls that still whispered, "I was here, I ruled." They began to read her again, not just as an anomaly, a woman king, but as a strategist, an architect, a high priestess of image and ritual. Every terrace, every column, every line of inscription had been part of her plan. You see, Hatshepsut understood something many rulers never do. That true power does not live in conquest, it lives in continuity. She did not break Egypt to remake it in her image. She became Egypt, worshipped Amun, even as she rewrote his will, wore the symbols of masculinity, even as she centered her womanhood in her origin myths, built temples to the gods, while quietly building one to herself. And in doing so, she created something very few rulers ever achieve, a dynasty of one. There were no sons to follow her, no line of descendants to claim her name. When she died, there was no heir, only a successor who had waited too long to erase her. And yet, she endures, through architecture, through quiet diplomacy, through art that refused to crumble. Even the temple itself speaks a language most never hear. The symmetry of its design is not just beautiful, it's symbolic. The rising terraces mirror the tiers of the heavens. The columns align with solstices. The entire structure becomes a prayer in stone, not to a god, but to order. And still today, it hums with that message. Tourists walk its quiet halls now. Children run past broken statues. Guides whisper her name in 10 different accents. But the stone remembers her clearly. She is not an icon of revolution. She is not a tale of rebellion. She is a lesson in persistence, in the long game of legacy, in the power of waiting, building, and shaping the world, not in loud moments, but in the slow layering of stone upon stone, meaning upon meaning. Think of it. How many rulers are remembered not for how they ruled, but for the chaos they caused? And how rare is it to find someone remembered for stability? Hatshepsut left no wars. She left obelisks. She left a temple that would not fall. She left a memory so buried that it had to be rediscovered like treasure. But what treasure it is, because in her, we find something deeply modern, though her time was ancient. A woman forced to wear a mask to be heard. A leader who knew that image was not illusion, but infrastructure. A builder who understood that the truest kind of immortality is not being remembered by name, but being built into the world itself. And that is what she did. She inserted herself into Egypt's stonework. She became, quite literally, part of the foundation. And so even when her name was scraped away, even when her face was struck with chisels, even when her image was rewritten, her story remained, waiting, not to shout, not to accuse, just to remind us that even silence, if shaped carefully enough, can echo for millennia. So next time you pass by something unassuming, an old building, a worn staircase, a name half erased, pause. There might be a Hatshepsut beneath the surface, someone who did not conquer the world, but who outlasted it. As the echoes of that story fade, let us drift into the next curious hour. The monks who measured dust. How medieval libraries tried to count the universe. Settle your thoughts. Let them drift backward, far from the world of glowing screens and humming engines, to a place of slow silence. You are now in a stone chamber, lit by a single flame. A draft pushes through the cracks in the walls, curling the edge of a page. Ink glistens wet on parchment, and somewhere nearby, a bell tolls the 6th hour of the afternoon. This is not a palace, not a temple. It is a monastery, and inside it, a monk is writing. His hands are cracked from cold, his spine aches from the hours of sitting, but he does not complain. To him, this work is not punishment, it is devotion, because he is not simply copying words, he is preserving the universe. You see, for much of the medieval world, knowledge did not live in bustling universities or public libraries. It lived in silence, in scriptoriums. These rooms, attached to abbeys and monasteries, were the quiet hearts of learning in an age that often feared curiosity. They were small, cold, and disciplined spaces where ink, wax, and time merged into legacy. And the monks who worked within them, they were the librarians of dust, not just keepers of books, but makers of them. Each book, in that age, was a precious object. It could take years to create. Parchment had to be made from animal skin, usually calf, goat or sheep, soaked in lime, scraped clean, dried and stretched until it became smooth and pale enough to receive ink. That parchment was expensive. A full Bible might require over 200 animals. Ink, too, had to be crafted, not bought. The black came from soot, mixed with gum and water. Reds were made from lead or cinnabar. Gold leaf required alchemy and delicate knives. Monks didn't just write, they engineered each page. But what, you may ask, were they writing? Scriptures, of course, lives of saints, psalters and sermons. But also quietly, patiently, they were copying knowledge from the ancient world. Greek philosophy, Roman engineering, astronomy, medicine, mathematics. To the modern eye it may seem strange that these men, devoted to prayer and silence, spent their lives transcribing the musings of Plato, the formulas of Ptolemy, the geometry of Euclid. But in the medieval world, knowledge was sacred, not because it was revolutionary, but because it revealed the order of things. To these monks, God had created the universe like a manuscript, full of symbols, patterns, margins, and meaning. The stars were footnotes, geometry, divine grammar. Copying Aristotle wasn't heresy. It was reading the handwriting of creation. So they copied, slowly, carefully, letter by letter, margin by margin. Many even developed complex spacing systems to preserve the rhythm of ancient languages, keeping alive not just the words, but the voice in which they had once been spoken. Some monks, particularly those in Irish and Carolingian monasteries, became obsessed with detail. Illuminated manuscripts, those rich, colourful pages you may have seen in museums, were not created to impress the public. They were made by candlelight, for God. A page of the Book of Kells might contain more than 10,000 tiny decorative details, microscopic animals, interlocking spirals, figures that curled into letters as if language itself was alive. It wasn't just beautiful, it was symbolic, because to these monks, if the universe was made in God's image, then every inch of a manuscript should reflect that harmony. Even the blank spaces mattered. They believed the gaps between letters mirrored the space between stars. The quiet of the margins was as sacred as the ink, and so they measured dust. They recorded the phases of the moon, the movements of comets, the eclipses, and the wandering of stars. They tried to calculate the age of the world using biblical genealogies and Roman calendars. Bede the Venerable, an Anglo-Saxon monk, created complex tables of time, trying to reconcile sacred chronology with the solar cycle. Others tried to square Plato with Genesis. They failed, often, but it wasn't the outcome that mattered, it was the act of ordering the cosmos through ink and thought. To them, that was salvation. And while the great cities of the old world crumbled, and wars raged, and kings rose and fell, the monks wrote, and wrote, and wrote. They preserved knowledge through plague and invasion, through famine and schism. Without them, we would have no Aristotle, no Cicero, no Galen, no Ovid, because even as the world burned, someone had to keep the books. So what kind of person devotes their life to this? To a life of silence, cold fingers, and fading ink, to copying what someone else said centuries before? The kind of person who believes that preservation is an act of faith, that every letter matters, that dust is not a sign of decay, but of continuity, that even in the smallest corner of the smallest monastery, a man with a candle and a quill could hold the universe in his lap. And what happens to a civilization when those candles go out? The candle flickers. A breath of wind slips through the high stone slit that passes for a window, and the flame dances, casting shadows over the rows of wooden desks. Beneath the shifting light, a monk dips his quill, squints through tired eyes, and continues tracing the long tail of a letter, one more shape in a language that he may not fully understand, but believes must be preserved. This is a scene repeated across Europe for centuries, from Iona to Monte Cassino, from Lindisfarne to Clondy. Monastic scriptoria became the unlikely ark that carried Western knowledge through the stormy seas of the early Middle Ages. But not all was harmony and contemplation. Knowledge, it turned out, was a fragile thing, easily broken, easily bound. And in time, even the libraries themselves began to treat it like something dangerous. By the 9th century, as monasteries expanded and their collections grew, the value of books became almost immeasurable. A single complete Bible could cost as much as a herd of cattle. Medical texts, astronomical charts, and ancient treatises were even rarer. They were irreplaceable, so they were chained, literally. In many libraries, manuscripts were attached to shelves by iron chains, long enough to be read but not removed. These chained libraries were designed not to restrict learning, but to preserve it, to make sure the knowledge stayed where it could be watched, and perhaps where it couldn't change. Because knowledge, when fixed too tightly, begins to rot. Take the calendar, for example. By the 11th century, many monastic scholars had become deeply interested in time, how to measure it, how to predict it, how to align it with the divine. They copied charts of eclipses, they calculated equinoxes, they tracked the phases of the moon for Easter, but the Julian calendar, which had been in use since Roman times, was drifting. It miscalculated the solar year by about 11 minutes annually. That seems small until centuries pass. By the 1200s, the spring equinox, once marked precisely on March 21st, had drifted backward by 10 days. This posed a problem not just for farmers and philosophers, but for priests. Easter was tied to the spring equinox. If the equinox moved, so did Easter. If Easter moved, so did the liturgical year. So the monks began recalculating, slowly, painstakingly. But change came hard. Even as they noticed the discrepancy, they hesitated to correct it. The old authorities, Bede, Isidore, Pliny, had said otherwise. And in a world where ancient texts were seen as divine echoes, contradicting them felt dangerous. The result? Generations of monks copied the same flawed calendar, even as they whispered among themselves that something seemed off. That was the paradox of their task. They were both preservers and prisoners of knowledge. To copy a book was sacred, to question it, sacrilege. So they recorded observations in margins, drew lunar charts, added small notes like, "The equinox fell on March 11 this year. Why?" The answers often went unspoken, but not all monks were content to copy quietly. In some abbeys, particularly in Arabic-speaking Andalusia and the Byzantine East, scholars began pushing the limits, translating Greek and Arabic texts on mathematics, alchemy, and medicine, copying them not into Latin, but into hybrid dialects, annotating them, even disagreeing with them. This cross-pollination sparked something new, not revolution, not yet, but questions. The kinds of questions that made the candlelight flicker. How old is the earth really? How do the stars move? Can we measure the shape of God's creation? Some monks turned to geometry, others to astronomy, many to silence. Because to ask too boldly was to risk being seen as curious, a dangerous reputation in a world that prized obedience, and so the margin became a sacred space. There, monks recorded anomalies, musings, quiet doubts. They charted comets, recorded floods, measured shadow lengths at noon, not because they planned to publish findings, but because they couldn't not notice. Even in silence they saw, even in chains, they measured. And sometimes they made mistakes, spelling errors, miscopied lines, ink blots. But even these errors mattered. They tell us now how texts traveled, how one version of a scroll in Italy picked up a Greek margin note that was copied as part of the main text in England, how a misinterpreted diagram in a Carolingian codex led to a century of confusion about planetary orbits. And yet, despite it all, despite drift and error and fear, the knowledge survived, not because it was flawless, but because it was loved, because in the end, a monk hunched over a scroll at midnight believed the act of writing was holy, that to count the stars was a kind of prayer, and that maybe, just maybe, preserving truth was worth the silence. But what happens when the silence becomes too heavy? When questions outgrow margins? It is evening again. The scriptorium is quieter than usual, not because the monks are not working, but because fewer are left. The wind howls just outside the thick stone walls, pushing snow against stained glass. A bell tolls not for prayer this time, but for passing. Plague has come. The 14th century is no longer a whisper on the horizon. It is here, riding on rats, carried in ships, pulsing through cities like dark thunder. The Black Death will claim between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population. Monasteries are not spared. Silence, once chosen, is now enforced by absence. And yet, in a small corner of the world, a monk continues to write. Even now, with fear thick as ash, he copies, because someone must. That someone, anonymous, stooped, tired, writes not just prayers now, but records the names of the dead, the symptoms of the dying, the timing of stars, the shape of the moon, the order of eclipses, not because he hopes to stop the plague, but because he knows the world is shifting and someone must witness it. His ink runs darker now. This is the twilight of the medieval scriptorium, not its sudden death, but its slow dimming. In the centuries to come, printing presses will replace scribes. Mass-produced books will flood Europe, carried on the backs of merchants and reformers. Universities will rise, libraries will swell, knowledge will no longer belong to the silent few. And yet, those candlelit libraries of old, the cold, echoing abbeys filled with chained books and dusty geometry, will have left something behind. A skeleton of learning, a scaffold for curiosity, and most importantly, continuity. Because without those monks measuring dust, copying calendars, and illuminating the corners of parchment, the ancient world might have vanished entirely. They were not philosophers, not inventors, not revolutionaries. They were patient, deliberate. They believed that to copy was to honor, that to preserve was to praise, that even if they could not understand every line, they had a duty to keep the line from dying. And in that way they were bridge builders, between Athens and Florence, between Rome and the Renaissance, between the stars and the printed page. Some of them knew, toward the end, that their way of life was passing, that the presses in Mainz and Nuremberg would outpace their quills, that the tide was turning from repetition to invention, and still they copied, not out of denial, but out of completion, because to leave the scroll unfinished would be worse than to be forgotten. And so on that final page, beneath the careful script, one might find a quiet colophon, finished in the year of our Lord 1428, in the Abbey of St. Godric, by Brother Thomas, for the sake of those yet unborn. That's what they believed in. Not glory, not genius, but legacy. So next time you open a book, not a glowing screen, but paper, binding, wait, pause. Consider what it means that you can hold knowledge in your hands, not because it was created yesterday, but because 1,000 years ago, someone in silence chose to keep it alive, even if he didn't understand it, even if it wasn't his, even if no one would ever know his name, because that is how civilizations endure, not through thunder, but through whisper. As the echoes of that story fade, let us drift into the next curious hour. The emperor's forgotten feast, how Justinian tried to feed the Roman world. Let your mind drift not to the fall of Rome, but to what came after, the moment when one man sat on a throne of marble and gold, staring west across a sea he intended to reclaim. His name was Justinian. His empire was Byzantine. His dream was Roman. And above all, he was hungry for control, for legacy, and quite literally, for bread. You may think of emperors as warriors, orators, or tyrants, but Justinian, who ruled from Constantinople in the 6th century, was something far more exhausting, an administrator. His mind ticked like a ledger, his hands itched for laws, and his obsession among many was to ensure that no citizen of his restored Roman Empire would ever go hungry. At least, not in theory. Let's begin with Constantinople itself. By Justinian's time, the city was already ancient, fortified by Theodosius's walls, humming with trade from Egypt, Syria, and the Black Sea. Grain ships arrived in fleets. Warehouses along the Golden Horn brimmed with sacks of wheat. The state, as was tradition since late Rome, maintained an annona, a government-controlled grain supply. Bread was not just food, it was policy. In Rome for centuries, free or subsidized grain had kept the population docile and loyal. Constantinople inherited that system, adapting it for a city of perhaps 500,000 souls. But Justinian wanted more than maintenance. He wanted expansion, reunification, a return to the grandeur of the Roman Empire. And that meant food had to flow not just in Constantinople, but across the entire Mediterranean. So he waged war, not with pitchforks or tariffs, but with scrolls, seals, and supplies. In 533, his general Belisarius invaded North Africa, once Rome's breadbasket. Carthage had long since fallen to the Vandals, but Justinian saw it as a critical artery. He needed the grain. The campaign was swift, victorious. Soon, Byzantine control stretched from Constantinople through the Aegean, down to Egypt, and back west to Carthage. Grain routes reopened, warehouses filled. Olive oil, wine, wheat, all began to move again through the arteries of empire. And Justinian? He built the bureaucracy to match. Grain inspectors, tax auditors, logistics coordinators. Entire offices were dedicated to managing bread quotas, scheduling ship departures, and counting how much grain dust stuck to a transport sack. No detail was too small. In Alexandria, he appointed overseers to monitor grain loading. In Sicily, state granaries were constructed with brick domes and vaulted storage designed to outlast earthquakes. He even reformed the coinage, just to make trade transactions more standardized. But bureaucracy is a double-edged sword. To keep it moving, you need more than paper, you need people. And the empire, though wide, was straining. Plague swept in through Egypt, carried on the very ships that brought grain. The Justinianic plague, as it's now known, began around 54. Within a few years, it would kill tens of millions. Constantinople lost nearly half its population. Still, Justinian tried to feed the survivors. When no one would bury the dead, he conscripted workers, paid them in grain, and dug mass graves. The granaries stayed open, the ovens kept baking, even when the fields were empty and the docks fell silent, even when rats outnumbered citizens. Still, he tried. That was Justinian's curse, and his legacy. He did not stop. His men reclaimed Ravenna, then Rome, then Naples. Each city required feeding. Each region required tax adjustments. Each victory required another ship, another ledger, another 1,000 loaves of bread. And in the shadow of his triumphs, a question lingered. Was it working? Was the empire truly reuniting? Was bread really holding it together? In a sense, yes. For a brief flickering moment, the Mediterranean trade routes hummed again with life. Byzantine flags fluttered from Alexandria to southern Spain. Warehouses brimmed, coins circulated, bakers returned to their ovens. But the center was growing brittle. Constantinople had expanded beyond what it could truly manage. Roads needed repairs, ships needed timber, harvests needed rain, and sometimes prayers. And while Justinian managed food like an accountant, he overlooked something even more essential: trust. Many of his reforms alienated local elites. His tax policies, often rigid and inflexible, angered farmers and merchants alike. Revolts brewed, not from lack of food, but from frustration at being treated like numbers in an emperor's spreadsheet. Still, he kept building, and dreaming, and counting. But how long can you feed a dream before it begins to eat you? By the middle of Justinian's reign, the empire looked impressive on maps. But beneath the carefully drawn borders and government seals, the seams were straining. The emperor's great reconquest stretched from the deserts of North Africa to the foggy hills of northern Italy. It looked Roman again. It smelled like victory. But victory needs supply lines, and those supply lines ran on wheat. Let's return to one of his biggest triumphs, the grain routes from Egypt. Egypt had fed empires since the days of the pharaohs. Its Nile-fed fields produced more than just grain. They produced consistency. Even a poor harvest along the Nile often yielded more than a good one in Sicily or Syria. Justinian knew this. That's why he poured resources into securing Alexandria and keeping the grain ships moving through the eastern Mediterranean. But those ships faced more than just pirates or storms. They faced delay. The Byzantine bureaucracy had grown so intricate, so tightly wound, that small failures became massive collapses. If one official miscounted sacks, if one inspector grew corrupt, if one port closed due to flooding or a dock workers' strike, the entire system could wobble, and when that happened, people didn't just go hungry, they got angry. Justinian tried to fix this, the only way he knew how, by adding more layers, more inspectors, more accountants, more clerks to monitor the clerks. He passed laws detailing exactly how much a ship could legally spill before it was considered theft. He standardized weights and measures across thousands of miles, trying to ensure that a sack of flour in Ravenna weighed the same as one in Antioch. He even attempted at one point to create state-controlled bakeries in provincial cities, taking direct control of food distribution so local officials couldn't hoard or price gouge. It was ambitious, it was complex, it was brittle. Because while Justinian dreamed of unity, nature had its own ideas. In 535, before the plague even arrived, something else happened. A cloud, a darkening of the sky, recorded across continents. Historians now believe it may have been a massive volcanic eruption, perhaps in Indonesia or Central America. Wherever it came from, its effects were global. Sunlight dimmed, temperatures dropped, crops failed. In Constantinople, the winter dragged into summer. Snow fell in places it had never touched. The Nile flooded unpredictably. Wheat yields shrank. Suddenly, Justinian's carefully balanced system, one that required precision and flow, was working with fewer resources, more mouths, and less trust. The grain riots began quietly. In Antioch, food prices spiked after 2 shipments failed to arrive. In Thessalonica, merchants were accused of hiding flour in private cellars. In Carthage, a local governor sent word that the warehouses had been raided, not by bandits, but by starving citizens. All the while, Justinian responded not with empathy, but with structure. He passed edicts. He reorganized supply chains. He sent letters sealed with gold leaf to governors, warning that the bread of the empire must not falter, but paper cannot feed a people. And then, plague. The Justinian plague hit Constantinople like a hammer on brittle glass. People collapsed in the streets. Ships floated unmanned in the harbors. Grain sat rotting in silos because no one could carry it. And still, Justinian calculated. He recorded losses, ordered mass graves, commissioned the construction of a new granary complex, even as the population who might need it was halving by the week. It's not that he didn't care, it's that he couldn't stop managing. For Justinian, to give up on logistics was to give up on the empire. And so he fed the sick, paid the burial crews, reissued currency, tried to replace dead workers with imported labor from the provinces, then watched as the plague spread outward again. To him, bread was not simply survival, it was identity. To feed was to rule. To lose control of bread was to lose the empire, and he nearly did. In Italy, his hard-won reconquest began slipping. Local populations, weary from plague and tax, began siding with the invading Lombards. In North Africa, Berber tribes rebelled. Egypt, ever the dependable breadbasket, became unpredictable. Yet still, Justinian ruled. He grew old, more reclusive, less seen in public, but he kept issuing reforms, some of them hundreds of pages long. The Corpus Juris Civilis, his great legal codex, outlived him. So did Hagia Sophia, the vast domed church he commissioned, built in part to celebrate his survival after riots nearly burned Constantinople to the ground. But his food system, his dream of feeding the empire, it began to unravel before his death. And after, it vanished, quietly. Grain fleets shrank, local control returned, tax policies were reversed. The empire survived, but the plan did not. Because dreams built on flour and forms are dreams vulnerable to wind and worm. Still, something remains. Even now, traces of Justinian's granaries linger in the archaeological record, bricks stamped with imperial seals, measuring stones with worn grooves, shipping contracts etched into wax tablets found in ruined ports, a system, long forgotten, that once tried to make bread the backbone of an empire. But can a world truly be held together by bureaucracy, by grain ships and quotas? Or does every loaf, no matter how warm, eventually crumble? In the final years of Justinian's life, the palace grew quieter. He still held court. He still issued laws. But something had changed, not just in the man, but in the machine he had built. The gears of the empire still turned, but now they squealed with the weight of a burden they could no longer bear. The dream of feeding the Roman world of stitching its provinces together through roads, grain ships and parchment, was faltering. And yet, no bells rang out to mark its death. It simply slowed. In the heart of Constantinople, the once bustling Horea, the great granaries along the Golden Horn still stood, massive stone vaults with layered ventilation, designed to keep grain dry for months. But many of them sat half empty. The harbour bustled less. The bakeries in the poorer districts began selling loaves made with barley husk and acorn flour, signs of quiet desperation. The population, reduced by plague and flight, could no longer support the machine that once fed them, and Justinian, whose gaze had once spanned continents, now looked inward. He continued to govern as if the empire were whole. Edicts still bore titles like "to the prefect of Africa" regarding shipment 98C. Grain quotas were still calculated down to the last modius, a Roman dry measure about the size of a basket. But increasingly, these were numbers on scrolls, not sacks in ships. Outside the capital, the story was worse. In Italy, the cities he had fought to reclaim, Naples, Rome, Ravenna, faced famine not from siege, but from neglect. As invasions ebbed and flowed, local officials clung to survival. Bakers abandoned government quotas. Taxes were paid in fish, not coin, and in the hills, warlords offered protection and bread in exchange for loyalty. This wasn't a dramatic collapse, it was erosion. One missing delivery at a time, one forgotten bakery, one administrator who stopped showing up. In Egypt, where the Nile once sang its promise of endless harvests, Justinian's reforms had left a bitter taste. His centralized grain policies had undercut local landowners. His demand for fixed grain exports left little for regional resilience. When the Nile failed to flood adequately in the late 540s, the result wasn't just hunger, it was disillusionment. The empire had promised bread, now it delivered silence, and yet Justinian persisted. Even in his final years, white-bearded, sleepless, surrounded by the gold and marble of the great palace, he continued issuing instructions for grain tariffs, port reforms, inspection policies. He still believed that order could overcome decay, but beneath the surface, his empire had changed. Its people no longer thought of themselves as parts of a unified Roman dream. They were Egyptians, Greeks, Syrians, Berbers, Italians. They turned inward, local, practical. They turned to village mills instead of imperial bakeries, to regional bishops instead of distant prefects, to trade routes that crossed no borders. The grand bureaucracy Justinian built became a shell, monumental in memory, hollow in function. And when he died in 565, his vision, his vast obsessive dream of restoration, died with him. The empire survived, shrunken. The great imperial granaries crumbled or were repurposed. The dream of feeding Rome from Carthage, of uniting Alexandria and Ravenna with wheat and scrolls, vanished into dust. Still, something lingers. In the ruins of Byzantine ports, archaeologists have found grain sieves, measuring scoops with handles worn smooth by use, fragments of shipping manifests written in Greek, Latin and Coptic, tools built not for war, but for feeding. They are not majestic, they do not gleam, but they whisper of a world that once tried, desperately, to keep people alive through coordination, not conquest. And maybe that is the strangest part of Justinian's story, that for all his laws, battles and palaces, he may be remembered best for his obsession with bread. He believed that an empire could be held together with flour and ledgers, and for a time it worked. But food, like power, must flow, and when it stops, so does belief. So tonight, if you find yourself slicing bread, perhaps for toast, perhaps for comfort, pause. Know that there was once a man, crowned in gold, who dreamed that bread could rebuild the world, and for a while, it almost did. As the echoes of that story fade, let us drift into the next curious hour. The button that changed everything. A very slow history of medieval clothing. Let your mind drift now, not to kings or conquests, but to the dim interior of a weaver's workshop in 13th century France. The floor is packed earth. The walls wattle and daub. A loom creaks softly in the corner, its threads pulled taut like the strings of a harp. And near the fire, someone is sewing, not for art, not for beauty, but for survival. Because in the medieval world, clothing wasn't about self-expression. It was about status and functionality, and sometimes survival. There was no such thing as fast fashion. A single tunic might be patched for 20 years. A cloak might pass through 3 generations. And a button, if you were lucky enough to own one, wasn't just a fastening device. It was a revolution. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. In the early Middle Ages, most people wore what we'd now call tube clothes, garments that were loose, draped, and designed to accommodate any body. Tunics for both men and women, often belted at the waist. Wool mostly, sometimes linen, always scratchy. Colors were muted unless you were wealthy. Dyes cost money. Indigo came from far-off lands. Tyrian purple, extracted from sea snails, was so expensive it was reserved for emperors and bishops. And as for sewing, it was basic. Straight lines, no darts, no shaping, no pockets. Clothes hung like blankets with sleeves, because fabric was too precious to waste, and tailoring too time-consuming to indulge. But slowly, very slowly, this began to change. And the change started, oddly enough, with an idea that clothing could fit. This idea crept into Europe through trade. From the Islamic world came more refined textiles, silks, cottons, lightweight weaves. From the Mongols came new patterns, tighter tunics, curved seams, fastenings that clung to the body. The Crusades, for all their chaos, also brought back ideas about garments that weren't just wrapped, but shaped. And with shaping came a problem. If your clothing was narrow enough to fit the body, how did you get into it? Enter the button. Buttons had existed for centuries, in India, China, even ancient Rome, but mostly as decoration. Little ornaments sewn onto robes. What medieval Europe discovered in the 1200s was not the button itself, but the buttonhole. That tiny slit, carefully sewn, that allowed a button to pass through and fasten cloth. It seems absurdly simple, but it changed everything. For the first time, clothing could close securely without pins, laces, or belts. It could cling to the wrist, fit the curve of the chest, shape the waist, and with that came a ripple effect across society. Tailors became more important. Fashion, as a concept, began to take root. But also, clothing became a code. Suddenly, what you wore said much more about who you were. Nobles wore tight sleeves with dozens of buttons, dozens just to prove they had the leisure time, or servants to fasten every one. Rich velvet doublets sported decorative buttons down the chest, even if they were never touched. Meanwhile, the working class wore simpler things, laces, toggles, maybe a single button on a collar, reused from an old coat. A well-buttoned tunic became a kind of social armor. And over time, this idea of clothing as identity solidified. Laws followed, sumptuary laws, rules that dictated what people were allowed to wear based on their social class, spread across Europe. In England, fur-trimmed sleeves were banned for anyone below knightly rank. In Florence, buttons made of precious metals were restricted to certain families. You could be fined for dressing above your station. And still, people tried. Buttons, it turned out, were like ambition. Small, subtle, but hard to resist. They showed up on sleeves, boots, cloaks, and hats. Some were purely functional. Others were extravagantly useless. They jingled, they glittered, they hinted, and in the background, tailors became silent power brokers. They knew the measurements of the nobility. They advised on colors, fabrics, cuts. Some even ran small side businesses, selling gently used noble garments to wealthy merchants eager to imitate aristocracy. But none of this happened overnight. The button didn't march in like a royal decree. It crept, quietly, through cloth, through custom, through time. And by the end of the 13th century, Europe was changing. Clothes were no longer just warmth or modesty. They were language. But what happens when language becomes too loud? When people wear things they shouldn't? When fashion gets political? The year is 1322. In a small town in Burgundy, a tailor is kneeling at the hem of a noblewoman's gown, adjusting a row of pearl-encrusted buttons along her ankle. She does not thank him. He does not expect it. Because in this world, a tailor is not a craftsman. He is a confidant, a quiet architect of social illusion. Clothing has become a battlefield, not just of taste, but of class. Across Europe, the rise of the middle class, merchants, bankers, guildsmen, has brought something unexpected to the world of wool and linen, money without titles. And with money comes mimicry. Merchants begin dressing like nobles, servants wear coats that fit too well. Guild leaders in London commission velvet cloaks with gold-stitched buttons, each one a quiet rebellion against centuries of hierarchy. And the nobles, they panic. In England, King Edward III passes a law. No one beneath the rank of baron may wear fur-trimmed sleeves or silk-lined hoods. In Florence, gold buttons are taxed. In France, laws dictate not only what you can wear, but how many buttons you may display on a single sleeve. The fear is not aesthetic, it's existential. Because if everyone can dress like nobility, how will anyone know who is noble? Clothing becomes surveillance. In towns, wardens are appointed to walk marketplaces, counting fur linings and button rows. Tailors are required to register their clients. Some cities even introduce clothing registries, proto-fashion police lists that catalogue who may wear what and when. But enforcement proves tricky. After all, who can resist a beautiful sleeve? So the tailoring trade flourishes underground. In side alleys and back rooms, clever seamstresses learn how to replicate noble patterns using cheaper fabrics. They trade in imitation pearls and tin buttons polished to gleam like silver, and the wealthy, they retaliate by doubling down. By the 1350s, noble fashion enters what some historians cheekily call the competitive sleeve era. Sleeves grow long enough to drag behind the wearer. They are slashed to reveal colored silks beneath. Some are stuffed with wool, rags, even sawdust to make arms appear broader, more imposing. Buttons become absurd. One nobleman's funeral inventory lists over 300 buttons sewn into his wardrobe, many of them purely decorative. Just imagine fastening them all by hand, unless of course you had a servant to do it. Meanwhile, peasants and artisans patch their tunics, save pennies for a single clasped cloak, and secretly copy patterns they see in church or market. It is, quietly, a fashion arms race, and still the button endures, because it is small, customizable. It bridges class divides like few things can. A noble might wear a button of silver, a butcher might wear one carved from bone, a washerwoman might save for a single mother-of-pearl fastener to pin her collar, but each button says, "Someone made this, and I chose it." That sense of choice, however small, was not insignificant in a world where most lives were scripted. By the 15th century, even children's clothing was tailored with buttons, cloaks closed snugly, doublets clung to waists, gowns opened in clever places for dancing or ease of movement, and in all this, the tailor remained at the center, not exalted, not always respected, but necessary. Some were highly paid, dressing nobility, clergy, and merchants alike. Others scraped by, patching old coats, repurposing wool from worn garments, saving scraps for their own families. A few, those with ambition, used tailoring to climb. In Florence, a tailor named Giovanni Sarto became wealthy enough to buy land. His grandson, Andrea del Sarto, became a famous painter. And in France, the descendants of court tailors married into minor nobility, proving that buttons could buy titles, eventually. But still, the button itself remained humble. It did not shout like jewels. It did not shine like gold. It whispered. And yet, those whispers wove a world where clothing mattered more than anyone could have imagined, where fabric became architecture, where a row of tiny discs could declare not only wealth, but identity. Still, not everyone embraced this change. There were critics, clerics who railed against vanity, writers who mocked the buttoned elite, moralists who warned that tailoring was a gateway to pride, and pride a gateway to ruin. And perhaps, in some cases, they were right, because in a world shaped by famine, plague, and war, the idea of spending hours crafting a sleeve that curved just so seemed absurd. But others saw it differently. They saw beauty in control, comfort in detail, a kind of quiet rebellion in the act of making something, anything that fit you. But where does this leave us, when everyone has buttons and no one knows who belongs where? The tailor's needle pauses mid-stitch. Outside, the late medieval town is stirring. Carts creak down muddy streets. A bell rings from the cathedral tower. A dog barks at a passing beggar wrapped in patched wool. But here, inside this small, smoky room, a transformation is taking place. Quiet, deliberate, unseen. The garment on the table is a doublet. It's made of dark wool, not silk. The seams are straight but strong. The sleeves are tapered. And on the left cuff, a single gleaming brass button has been sewn. Not for function, but for pride. This is not the robe of a noble, nor the rags of a peasant. It is something new, the outfit of a citizen. By the 15th century, the social role of clothing had shifted yet again. No longer just about rank or wealth. It was increasingly about identity. And buttons, those once humble fasteners, were at the center of it. In the growing cities of Europe, especially in places like Bruges, Ghent, Milan, and Nuremberg, urban life was reshaping the medieval order. Guilds rose to power. Merchants established dynasties. Craftsmen and bankers began buying homes with tiled roofs and carved lintels. Their children learned Latin. Their wives wore fitted gowns trimmed in squirrel fur. And their coats, they closed with buttons. often matching the colors of their trade guild. You see, the button had evolved beyond utility. It had become a badge. Goldsmiths wore buttons stamped with tiny hammers. Dyers chose buttons dyed with the rarest tints they could afford. Wool merchants wore horn buttons polished so smooth they gleamed like glass. It was fashion, but also declaration. I belong, not to a noble house, not to a feudal domain, but to this town, this trade, this new way of being, in a world that had long defined people from above, by king, by land, by church. The rise of the button citizen hinted at something far quieter, but more radical, self-definition. And so began the slow democratization of fashion. Not in law, not in theory, but in seams. Clothing no longer just marked you as rich or poor, it marked you as distinct. People began customizing their garments with trim, buttons, and fasteners that reflected their taste, their tools, their lives. Young men wore shorter tunics to signal boldness. Apprentices stitched extra buttons onto cuffs to prove they could afford not to use them all. Women adopted side-buttoned bodices that curved to the body, a design both flattering and protective, especially for those working in shops or walking city streets alone. And yet, for all this subtle rebellion, society still tried to clamp down. Sumptuary laws remained. One city in Germany banned the use of cloth of gold for anyone below patrician rank. In Florence, buttons made from imported bone were briefly taxed as luxury items, but enforcement wavered. There were simply too many people, too many outfits, too many buttons, and so clothing became more personal and more political. A button could now be used to signal loyalty. Guild members wore matching fasteners during parades. Some rebels pinned concealed tokens under their cloaks, tiny buttons marked with secret sigils, shared only among their group. In certain cities, buttons even became tools of seduction. A well-placed row down the side of a gown could hint at intimacy, suggest daring. Poets began mentioning them in their verses. She slipped the button of her sleeve and let the candle see her skin. But not all button stories were poetic. In the colder corners of Europe, buttons meant warmth. Mothers stitched rows of them onto their children's collars, not for beauty, but to keep out snow. In hospitals and almshouses, volunteers used scrap fabric and carved wooden buttons to outfit the poor with coats that could actually close against wind. A button was, increasingly, a marker of dignity. To be able to fasten your own clothes without safety pins or rope was to belong, however modestly, to a world of order, a world of choice. And in the quieter corners of the medieval period, that mattered. It mattered to the widow who reused her husband's coat, cutting it down and sewing in her own buttons, reinventing herself after grief. It mattered to the young journeyman who wore his father's tunic, now too short, but fixed with a new row of brass buttons bought from a traveling peddler. It mattered to the seamstress who could finally afford to make buttons instead of buy them, shaping them from horn, wood, bone, even pressed cloth, stiffened with wax. So much effort, so much thought for a fastener. But perhaps that's the lesson of the button, that even the smallest things, when multiplied across time, can remake a world. A button isn't a revolution, but it can be a record of class, of taste, of hands that worked in silence so someone else could dress with pride. And when the Renaissance arrived with its lace collars, fitted bodices, slashed sleeves, and sculpted doublets, it brought more flamboyance, more color, more fashion. But it brought nothing more quietly powerful than the button, the object that closed a coat, the object that opened a future. So tonight, when you pull on a shirt, zip a jacket, or fasten a cuff, pause, consider the hundreds, thousands of nameless hands that shaped the history of your outfit, not with speeches, not with crowns, but with thread and the patience to push it through a hole. As the echoes of that story fade, let us drift into the next curious hour. The city that overslept. How ancient Ephesus missed its own collapse. It is morning in Ephesus. Birds flutter between the columns of the agora, and a faint scent of myrtle floats through the colonnaded streets. The stalls are opening. Olive oil glistens in clay amphorae. Fig cakes are stacked in reed baskets. Philosophers in white robes are arguing gently beneath the sun-dappled portico of the Library of Celsus. This city, by all appearances, is alive, prosperous, important, but it is already dying, and no one knows. You see, collapse rarely begins with a bang. It begins with a whisper, with dust that gathers unnoticed, with decisions that feel reasonable in the moment, with time that creeps forward like ivy over stone. Ephesus was once one of the great cities of the Roman world, located near the Aegean coast of Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. It boasted grand boulevards paved in marble, a massive amphitheater that held 25,000 people, and the great Temple of Artemis, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It had been a cultural hub under the Greeks, a commercial juggernaut under the Romans, and in the early centuries of the Christian era, a spiritual battleground, visited by Paul the Apostle, debated by bishops, home to heresies and councils alike. But beneath all this glory, the river Silt was rising. Ephesus had been founded near the mouth of the Cayster River, whose slow winding path had always been both a blessing and a threat. It brought fertile soil and trade, but also carried centuries of mud. As early as the 1st century BCE, ships began reporting trouble reaching the city's harbour. Sandbars formed, channels shifted. By the time of Emperor Hadrian, the Roman engineers were dredging the port constantly, scraping away silt, trying to keep the sea connected to the city. But silt is patient, and cities are proud. Rather than move or adapt, Ephesus doubled down. They widened streets, built fountains, erected new temples. Inscriptions from the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE still praise benefactors who funded port repairs, water channels, and new roads, none of which addressed the central issue. The coastline was leaving them behind. But pride, as history shows, often blinds, and Ephesus still looked successful. Its library gleamed with imported marble, its theatre echoed with plays and processions, its shops sold Eastern spices, Roman glass, and Egyptian grain. Tourists arrived from across the empire. Pilgrims climbed the hills to see Mary's final resting place. Christianity spread, then imperial patronage, then bishops with purple robes and political sway. And yet, the harbour continued to vanish. By the 4th century, what had once been a bustling port city had to build new roads to connect itself to the sea, roads that grew longer every decade. But the decline wasn't linear. The city kept trying. Churches replaced temples, markets shifted inland. A new basilica rose where Artemis's columns had once cast their shadow. And still, the dust came. Not just literal, cultural, economic, symbolic. Ephesus was slowly turning inward. It still called itself great, still lit its streets at night. But its trade had slowed, its fountains cracked, its population began to shrink, gradually, then faster. Yet few wrote about it. Because people rarely document a slow fall. The Ephesians likely didn't say, "We are collapsing." They said, "The roads need repair this year. The ships are delayed again. The taxes are a bit higher." But the signs were there. More and more homes in the wealthy districts were left empty. The once busy theatre hosted fewer performances, more religious speeches. Public baths were closed, then used as grain storage. And still, the city functioned. It didn't burn. It faded. By the 7th century, the silting had reached a point of no return. The harbour, once the lifeblood of the city, was now a marsh. Malaria crept in. Traders stopped coming. And yet the city still called itself Great Ephesus, because collapse doesn't feel like collapse when you're inside it. It feels like inconvenience, like change, like something that will pass. But what happens when a city keeps calling itself a capital long after the trade is gone? When the streets are swept, but no longer used? When temples become churches, then ruins, then stone quarries? Ephesus would eventually be abandoned altogether, but not with flames or conquest, just silence. And in that silence, the library of Celsus stood, its empty niches, once filled with scrolls and scholars, watching as grass crept up the marble steps, watching as no one came. The city of Ephesus had once stretched its arms wide, open markets, grand avenues, a harbour that welcomed ships from Rhodes, Egypt, Athens, even distant Hispania. But now, century by century, those arms were drawing in. In the 7th century, Ephesus did what many cities do in decline. It built walls, not the old kind, meant to impress visiting dignitaries or parade Roman legions. These new fortifications were rougher, pieced together with materials scavenged from abandoned temples and crumbling civic buildings. Corinthian columns became lintels. Marble gods were turned face first into mortar. The once wide-spanning metropolis now shrank behind these improvised defenses, retreating, literally, from the world. It wasn't the first time such a thing had happened in the Roman world. Post-collapse Rome itself had huddled into the Campo Marzio. Antioch walled off empty districts. Alexandria turned civic squares into fortified barracks. But in Ephesus, the shrinking was especially tragic, because the city's image had always outlived its reality. Even as the sea crept away and silt swallowed the harbor, Ephesus remained a center of Christian pilgrimage. It still hosted bishops, councils were convened there, imperial decrees continued to mention it as a civic jewel, but the jewel had cracks, and the hands polishing it were growing fewer. People moved inland, new trade routes bypassed the marshes, wealth retreated to nearby hills, to villas and safer farmland. The bustling marketplaces, once full of olive oil, perfumes, eastern silks, now hawked onions, coarse grain, and bits of second-hand cloth. And the great streets of marble, weeds, goats, children playing with fragments of fallen statues. Still, the faithful came. The Church of Mary, built on the ruins of a pagan temple, became a magnet for pious travelers. Pilgrims believed the Virgin had lived her final days here, guided by John the Evangelist. A sacred house on the mountain, a trickling spring. Even Emperor Theodosius II acknowledged the site in official letters. But pilgrimage could not replace commerce, and soon even the pilgrims slowed, because the roads were no longer safe. Bandits roamed the countryside, earthquakes struck, and in 654, Arab raiders sailed up what remained of the Caister's sluggish mouth, burning buildings, looting relics, taking prisoners. It was not a conquest, it was a warning. Ephesus was no longer protected by empire. It was just another vulnerable city, pretending it was still great. But the people stayed, some of them. They still swept the church steps, they patched walls, they baked bread, they held processions, even as water turned to marsh, even as priests muttered prayers over fields where granaries had once stood, even as the city's name faded from trade maps. Still they remained, because collapse does not always mean abandonment. Sometimes it means clinging harder to what used to be. A few stones were laid on top of old ones, a broken fountain was reused as a well, a family lived inside the ruins of a bathhouse, a tailor stitched tunics where Roman senators once debated law, and through it all, the city still looked like Ephesus in parts. From a distance, the amphitheater still curved like a sleeping eye. The library's facade still stood, sun-bleached and noble. The temple of Artemis, once so vast it stunned Herodotus into awe, was now little more than a platform, but it felt holy. That's the strange thing about ruins. They hold shape long after they've lost function. They echo what was, even if what is has forgotten. And so the citizens of Ephesus adjusted, not with revolution, with resignation, with small practical acts of preservation, until even that became too much. By the 10th century, the marshes brought mosquitoes. Malaria returned. The water clogged the aqueducts. The church roofs sagged. And slowly, the last Ephesian citizens drifted away, up into the hills, toward the town that would become modern-day Selçuk. They did not burn their city. They did not mourn it publicly. They simply stopped sweeping, stopped repairing, stopped lighting candles in the church. The city remained, but it no longer belonged to anyone. It became a skeleton in sunlight, stone terraces for birds, crumbling niches filled with bees, a theater that echoed only wind. And for centuries, it slept, a city that had died not from destruction, but from forgetting. What does it mean when a city doesn't fall? It just fades. For nearly 1,000 years, Ephesus lay still. Rainwater pooled in the hollowed shells of temples. Ivy twisted through library columns like punctuation marks left behind in a forgotten book. And beneath the layers of silt and dust, the bones of the city waited, intact, almost eerily so, not shattered by war or toppled by fire, just buried, quiet. It wasn't until the late 19th century that Ephesus began to stir again, this time under the hands of archaeologists. In 1869, a team sponsored by the British Museum began searching for the Temple of Artemis. They dug through farmland, marsh, and mounds of unassuming earth. At first there was nothing, then column fragments, mosaic chips, bits of painted plaster, and then, slowly, the city began to rise from the soil, like a memory returning after sleep. The Library of Celsus re-emerged, its facade still standing, its empty niches staring back at the sun as if they'd never stopped watching. The marble-paved Curate Street, which once connected civic buildings and bathhouses, uncoiled like a pale spine between ruined houses. Even the Great Theatre, 25,000 seats wide, sat mostly intact, its rows curving upward like a stone wave ready to hold applause again. What stunned the excavators wasn't just the scale, it was the preservation. Ephesus hadn't been rebuilt atop itself. It hadn't been cannibalized by later empires the way Rome or Athens had. It had simply stopped being. Its death had been so slow that in the end, no one had bothered to repurpose it, and so it slept, whole. This gave archaeologists a rare gift, a snapshot of a late antique city, frozen in time. They found homes with intact mosaics, shops with amphorae still stacked in back rooms, churches with altars still bearing fragments of incense dust. But as they dug deeper, beneath the streets, beneath the basilicas, they found something else, something quieter, layers of adjustment. In the 5th century houses, they found reused columns from 2nd century villas. In the former marketplace, they found grain storage jars dug into the tiled floor, signs that commerce had given way to mere subsistence. They found bathhouses that had been divided into homes, shrines turned into workshops, statue pedestals used to anchor laundry lines. Each of these changes told a story, not of disaster, but of improvisation. Ephesus had not fallen, it had shrunk, it had bent under pressure, adapted, compromised, and then, when it could adapt no more, it had simply drifted out of focus. Even the church, the Basilica of St. John, once a major pilgrimage site, had been stripped of its roof tiles, its frescoes faded, its baptistry cracked, pilgrimage routes moved elsewhere, trade died, the river choked, but the city never said goodbye. There were no mass graves, no charred walls, no signs of conquest, just layers of stillness. So the question arises, when did Ephesus end? Was it when the last bishop left? When the harbour became impassable? When the last amphora was stacked in a quiet room and forgotten? Or was it even later, when no one could quite remember where the city had been? In many ways, Ephesus represents the most honest version of how most places die. Not in fire, not in conquest, but in inattention. The world moved on, the river moved on, and Ephesus, once proud, simply failed to notice. And maybe that's the most human story of all, because don't we do the same? Fail to see the quiet changes that accumulate. Let the dust gather, day by day, until we don't remember what it used to look like clean. Ephesus didn't collapse, it was simply outpaced. By water, by time, by history. But in its sleep, it preserved something rare, a moment of transformation, of Roman becoming Christian, of temple becoming basilica, of amphitheater becoming echo chamber. And now, when visitors walk its silent streets, they don't see ruin, they see layers. And in those layers, humanity, hopes built in marble, adjustments carved in clay, prayers whispered between repairs. So next time you see a ruin, be it a broken chair in a hallway or a forgotten building in your town, don't ask only what destroyed it. Ask instead what it held on to and how long it tried. Because some cities go out with a scream, but others, like Ephesus, go out while they're still whispering. We're fine, just a little dust. We'll clean it up tomorrow. As the echoes of that story fade, let us drift into the next curious hour. The peasant who measured the sky, how a farm boy predicted eclipses before telescopes. It begins, as many quiet miracles do, with a boy sitting on a hill. The wind is mild, the goats are grazing, the fields stretch out below, patchworked in wheat and barley, and above, the sky, open, indifferent, eternal. He is not royalty, not a scribe, not a scholar from Alexandria or Baghdad. He is a peasant, a boy named Wulfric, or Johannes, or Matteo. His name doesn't matter, because it is one of thousands, but his eyes are fixed not on the earth, but on the moon. It's the early 11th century. Somewhere in Western Europe, perhaps in the Frankish countryside, perhaps in the foothills of the Pyrenees, an ordinary boy is keeping time the only way his family knows how, by the light and shadow of the heavens. There are no clocks in his world, no textbooks. The village priest owns the only book, and it's chained to a lectern in the chapel. But the boy watches. Every night he notes when the moon rises, when it disappears behind hills, when its shape changes, from thin silver curve to fat white plate and back again. He draws circles in dirt, counts days with bits of stone, scratches tick marks on a barn beam, because even though no one has told him to, he needs to understand. Why does the moon vanish sometimes? Why does it turn red? Why does the sun grow dark in the middle of a day? In his village, people call these events signs, omens, warnings. When the sun darkens, the baker covers the windows. When the moon turns blood red, the priest gives an extra sermon. But the boy, he is not afraid, he is curious. And that curiosity begins to take shape. By the age of 12, he's made a crude calendar from a piece of wood. He marks lunar cycles with notches, matches their return to the planting of barley and the birth of lambs. He begins to guess, quietly, and never aloud, when the next dark moon might come. By 14, He's building what he later calls his sky stick, a carved piece of oak set in the ground, with a sliding piece on top to track the angle of the rising moon. It's wildly imprecise, but it works enough to teach him rhythm, and rhythm is the heart of all astronomy. He begins rising earlier, watching the morning stars, tracing their paths over barns and tree lines. He learns when Venus appears, when Orion tilts. The other villagers don't mind. He's odd, but kind, and when he tells the shepherd to bring the sheep in a day early, because the light will vanish tomorrow, they laugh. But the next day, the sun fades just after noon, an eclipse. The village gasps. The priest prays, but the boy just sits, watching. He has no telescope, no access to Arabic manuscripts, no university tutors, no astrolabe, only a stick, a sky, and the burning question, what makes the heavens move? He is not alone in this. Across medieval Europe, in small farms and cloisters, people are watching the skies, quietly, patiently, writing down dates in the corners of psalters, notating odd moon shapes in margins, sketching stars on scraps of vellum. In monastic libraries, monks copy fragments of Ptolemy. In Islamic Spain, scholars translate Greek into Arabic, Arabic into Latin, and in the farmlands, children stare at the same stars. Wulfric, if that was his name, begins to experiment. He places stones in a field, each where the moon first appears in the sky each evening. By the end of a month, the arc is clear, so he places a stone each time the full moon rises. Over seasons, he sees a pattern. The moon does not return to the same place each month. It shifts, slightly, subtly, but predictably. He doesn't know it yet, but he's beginning to track the Saros cycle, the rhythm of eclipses, roughly every 18 years and 11 days, known to the Babylonians but forgotten in much of medieval Europe. His notes are carved into wood, charcoal on scrap cloth, symbols only he fully understands. But one year, he's nearly a man now. He makes a prediction. He tells the village priest, the moon will vanish 5 nights after the new moon, in early summer. The priest humors him. But when it happens, when the moon slips into shadow, reddish and quiet, the priest stops smiling. The boy becomes something else now, not just a shepherd's son, not just the sky watcher. He becomes the one who knows. He is invited to nearby villages. The bishop's steward asks if he might teach the local students. He's no longer a child, but not yet a man of the cloth, somewhere between faith and earth, somewhere between sign and science. And so begins his strange second life, traveling by mule, carrying his sticks and stones, his carvings and crude diagrams. He's no Copernicus. He has no model of the solar system, but he has something equally rare in his time. Proof. He can say with some accuracy when the moon will fade and when the sun will vanish. And while the world may not yet be ready for telescopes, for formulas, for Renaissance revolution, it is more than ready for a boy who can measure the sky. But how far can you go when your tools are wood and instinct? What happens when your predictions stop being wonders and start being threats? The boy, now a man, rides into town with a satchel of pebbles, not scrolls. He speaks little Latin. He cannot write his own name in formal script. But when the monks of the priory ask when the next eclipse will occur, he places 3 stones on a worn table and murmurs, "In the 3rd month, 2 days before the full moon, the shadow will come." He is correct, again and again and again. Word spreads, quietly, then urgently. People begin arriving from nearby villages when he makes his predictions. They gather in fields. Some pray, some hide, some weep in silence. A black sun does strange things to belief. Most have never heard the word Saros. They do not know Babylon or Hipparchus. They only know that this man, this peasant, seems to understand when the heavens will go dark. And that frightens them. Because in a world of mystery, the one who names the storm becomes more terrifying than the storm itself. In the priory, whispers grow louder. Some say he is touched by God. Others say he is dangerous. Only the Creator knows the heavens. A monk murmurs, "How can a man like him know the mind of God?" In public, the man is careful. He always speaks in questions. He reminds listeners that all things serve the divine pattern, that he is only guessing, only watching. But in private, his notes become more refined, no longer scratches in dirt or cloth. Now he carves lines into wooden boards. He begins to recognize retrograde motion, how some stars shift backward as they traverse the sky. He notices Venus's pattern, Mars's slower pace. He builds a crude armillary sphere, a wooden model of the heavens, based on diagrams seen in a monastery library. He turns it slowly in the candlelight. It creaks like an old door, but it works. His insights are not theoretical. They are observed, repeated, tracked. He cannot read Aristotle. He has never heard of Al-Zarqali, or Ayabata, but he knows what he sees, and in the towns he visits, some begin calling him the moon turner. Still, the tension rises. One autumn, he travels to a larger city, invited by a curious archbishop who has heard of his work. He brings his sky stick, his wood carvings, his folded lunar charts, stained with ash and sweat. He tries to explain, but the bishop, though polite, frowns when the man speaks of prediction. It is one thing to record the stars, another to know their schedule. The man is offered lodging in the cathedral's guest house, but the next morning, he is told his presence is no longer needed. No reason given. He is sent away with a small loaf of bread, 3 coins, and a blessing that feels more like a dismissal. So he returns to the hills, to the goats, to the shadows, but the sky still moves, and he still watches. In his later years, he becomes more cautious. He teaches 2 village children to count lunar phases using polished stones. He builds sundials in 3 towns, none signed, all forgotten. He stops predicting eclipses publicly, but he tracks them anyway, carving dates into fence posts and barn doors. Quiet marks, silent math, and in time, he dies. Not in scandal, not in glory, in sleep, beside the same hill where he first watched the moon rise. The village priest offers him a simple burial. There is no monument, no scroll, no legacy. His tools are used for firewood, his carvings fade, his name is lost. But centuries later, when scholars dig through abandoned chapels, half-collapsed barns, and the stone walls of forgotten farms, they sometimes find strange carvings, circles inside circles, lines that match lunar tables, marks spaced precisely 29 days apart. One such discovery, found on a plank in a ruined French barn, was dated to the 11th century. The marks aligned with the known dates of 5 lunar eclipses. Another board, preserved in a monastery attic in Galicia, bore 223 notches, exactly the length of one Saros cycle. There were no names, no signatures, only patterns, but they tell us something quietly extraordinary, that even in a world without telescopes, theory, or institutional support, someone, some many, watched, counted, mapped the sky with fingers and memory, not to challenge the heavens, but to understand them, and to share that understanding, even when it meant suspicion, exile, or silence, because for every Copernicus, there were 1,000 unnamed Wulfrics and Matteos and Johanns, boys who measured with candlelight and guessed with stones, who built a foundation for others to build upon, and who proved in their quiet way that wisdom does not always come from books, it can also come from watching. But what becomes of knowledge when the knower is forgotten? The boy who once stared at the moon is gone, his tools are scattered, his name is no longer spoken, his charts have rotted into soil, and his grave, if ever marked, is long reclaimed by pasture and vine. But his work, like the light of a long-dead star, travels still, because not all legacies are made of monuments, some are made of questions. In the centuries that followed, more such questions would rise. Monks in England would chart eclipses in the margins of psalters. Arabic-speaking astronomers in Al-Andalus would build detailed lunar tables, preserving Greek, Indian, and Babylonian knowledge in Arabic script, and eventually Latin. In the 12th century, when European translators finally carried that knowledge back north through Toledo and Sicily, something odd happened. Some of the things they found, Europeans already knew, not in formal terms, not with the equations of Ptolemy or Al-Zarqali, but by rhythm, by experience, passed from farmer to apprentice, from sky watcher to child. The sky had been measured, even without mathematics, a tradition without a name, a thread beneath the fabric of history. In time, the Renaissance would make stargazing respectable again. Galileo would build a telescope, Kepler would describe elliptical orbits, Newton would trace the force that held planets in place. But long before that, centuries before heliocentrism, there were those who sat alone with the moon and counted, quietly, faithfully, without reward. Some scholars today call this the folk astronomy of medieval Europe, the half-seen, half-lost practice of watching the heavens, not for science or scripture, but for survival, for planting, for fasting, for weather. But perhaps it was more than that. Perhaps it was a way of placing oneself inside the grand turning of things, of saying, I too am part of this pattern. Because there is something deeply human about trying to understand the sky. We are born beneath it. We live under its shifting moods. We tell time by its light, mark seasons by its tilt, measure our brief lives against its endlessness. To watch it, really watch it, is to admit that we are small and yet capable of noticing, of naming, of remembering, and in that we find meaning. Even now, in the age of satellites and observatories, many of us still look up when the moon is full. We feel something ancient stir when the sun darkens, when the stars brighten suddenly on a cold winter night. We reach for cameras, but once we reached for sticks and stones, we carved notches, we whispered guesses, we counted shadows, and we watched. So tonight, if you happen to glance at the sky, let it be more than passing, let it be curious. Try to remember a time when there were no models, no apps, no charts, only sky and silence and wonder. Try to imagine a boy sitting on a hill, drawing circles in the dirt and asking, why does the moon come back? When will it vanish again? And what does it mean when the sun disappears, just for a moment in the middle of the day? He never got famous, never got published, but maybe, just maybe, he was the first in your village to understand the stars. As the echoes of that story fade, let us drift into the next curious hour. The forgotten art of medieval laundry, why it took all week. Before machines, before detergent, and long before anyone argued about fabric softeners, laundry was an ordeal, not an errand, not a chore, an event. And in the medieval world, it wasn't done in a few hours on a Saturday afternoon. It was an entire week or more of soaking, boiling, scrubbing, wringing, rinsing, drying, shaking, folding, mending, and if one was fortunate, airing over rosemary and smoke to cover the lingering smell of lye. Let us begin on a Monday, because even then, Mondays were for washing. And in villages across Europe, whether nestled in the hills of Wales, tucked behind hedgerows in Burgundy, or pressed against the foothills of the Alps, this was a rhythm everyone knew. At the heart of it all stood the laundress, not a side character in history, but a central figure in daily survival, almost always a woman, sometimes hired, sometimes a wife or mother, sometimes a nun in a priory's workhouse. Her tools? A bucket, a bar of hard soap, or a paste made of boiled plant ash, and most crucially, access to water. Running water was everything. Those who lived near a stream, a well, or a spring were blessed. Those who didn't carried heavy wooden pails for miles, again and again. Because one thing you learn very quickly when washing linen by hand is just how much water fabric can hold. A wool tunic, once soaked, could weigh more than a goat. Let's imagine a small village on the edge of a forest in 13th century Saxony. The sun rises, barely skimming the thatched rooftops. In a clearing near the stream, several women gather, baskets slung on hips, sleeves tied up, skirts tucked in. They're here to begin the soaking. Clothes, especially undergarments, chemises, stockings and bed linens, have been piled up since the last wash day, perhaps 2 weeks ago. They are stiff, they are sour, they are heavy with the scents of bodies, smoke, damp straw, and sometimes worse. But that's why today exists. To begin the cleansing. The first step, soak it all in cold water, sometimes with a handful of wood ash stirred in. This wasn't to clean it. It was to loosen the grime, the grease, the oils worked into fabric from skin and cooking smoke. The clothes were pushed down into barrels or tubs with long sticks, pounded, twisted, then left overnight. In monasteries, novices might perform this work in silence, their hands red and raw by dusk. But peasant women sang. Washing songs helped mark the rhythm. Turn the cloth, beat the stain, rinse the sweat and scrub the grain. A melody to move the muscles. Next came the real work, scrubbing. That happened on stones, flat ones by the river, or carved wooden boards laid over troughs. Lye was poured in. Lye, in medieval Europe, was made from leaching water through ashes, usually from hardwood. The result was caustic, slippery, and highly effective at breaking down fat and dirt. But it was also brutal. Hands cracked, fingernails peeled, and cloth, over time, wore thin. Scrubbing was followed by boiling. Yes, boiling. Clothes, especially white linens, were layered in large copper cauldrons, covered with hot lye water, and brought to a near boil over open fire. In manors or convents, this could be done in dedicated washhouses. In farms, it was done outside, wind blowing ash into hair, fire crackling dangerously close to hems. The process took hours, and it wasn't just for cleaning. Boiling killed lice, melted grease, loosened sweat and soot from long winter wear. After boiling came rinsing, and rinsing again, because any trace of lye left in fabric would cause skin burns. So the women dragged heavy, steaming linens to the river. They slapped them on rocks, pressed out water, rinsed them again, then hung them over hedges, bushes, or wooden frames in the sun. And while they dried over a day or more, another task began: repair. Because washing tore things. Stitches burst, seams wore thin, mice had chewed holes, drawstrings snapped. So women sat in doorways with bone needles and homespun thread, patching, darning, reinforcing. It was never just about cleaning. It was about keeping things alive just a little longer. A shirt might be mended 20 times before being turned into rags. And even rags weren't useless. They were woven into mats, stuffed into pillows, or used to strain cheese. Every fiber was precious. By the end of the wash week, the air smelled of ash, smoke, sun-dried linen, and rosemary if you were lucky. In some regions, herbs were laid between folds of cloth to scent them. In wealthier homes, lavender was burned in basins beneath laundry as it hung. But for most, the best scent was simply not awful. Clean was a relative term, a tunic free of lice, a bed linen that no longer smelled like sweat and straw, and most of all, a sense of order, because laundry was more than hygiene. It was ritual, it was dignity, it was a way to push back against the unclean, the uncontrollable, the chaos of a muddy world where few things stayed fresh for long, and yet it took days, it broke backs, it ate wood and water and time. So why was it done? Because even in the most forgotten corners of medieval life, people cared about cleanliness. Maybe not the way we define it now, but in the way of rhythm, reset, restoration. And maybe that's something we still feel. Some echo of that old order when we empty our hampers on a Monday morning. Maybe laundry still carries the ghost of boiled soap root, of songs over cold streams, of sun-warmed linen, and hands sore from labor. But what did people do in winter, when rivers froze and cauldrons cracked? In the quiet grip of winter, when rivers froze and firewood was scarce, medieval laundry didn't stop. It just changed. Instead of open-air scrubbing by streams, people relied on indoor wash spaces, fire-warmed basins, and a slow, calculated system of necessity. Because in winter, laundry wasn't about freshness, it was about survival. Let us return to the same village in Saxony, or perhaps we've drifted to a Cistercian monastery in Burgundy. Either way, it's mid-January, and the earth is hard with frost. You wake before dawn. Your breath fogs the air inside your cottage. You slept in the same linen shift for a week, maybe two. The wool tunic over it itches with dust, and the hem has gone stiff with dirt from the stable floor. Washing day must come. But in winter, the stakes are higher. Wet cloth freezes quickly, fingers crack, and firewood is too precious to waste on long hours of boiling. So medieval families washed selectively, only what was needed. Underthings, cloth used for swaddling or bandaging, and linens close to the skin. And instead of full immersion, many households practiced spot washing, laying garments near the hearth, dampening them with warm water, and scrubbing only the soiled areas with salt, ash, or stale urine. Yes, urine, which was rich in ammonia and used as a powerful cleaning agent throughout antiquity and the Middle Ages. After spot washing, the cloth would be dried near the fire on racks, turned carefully to avoid scorching. But not everyone had a hearth wide enough to dry linens. In small homes, damp laundry hung from rafters, collecting the smoke of cooking and heating fires. That gave clothes a dark, woodsy scent. Not exactly fresh, but better than rot. Meanwhile, in monasteries, winter washing was handled with the precision of scripture. Cistercian monks, for instance, followed strict timetables. Laundry was done in designated buildings called lavatoria, often stone-walled and fitted with built-in basins that allowed water from nearby springs or aqueducts to flow through. Monks washed their habits, long woolen robes, less frequently than layfolk, but with more reverence. They bathed communally, in silence, often reading psalms in their heads as they worked. Soap, when available, came in several forms. In southern Europe, Castile soap, made from olive oil and lye, was prized. It lathered gently and left fabrics soft. But in the north, soap was harder, chalkier, and less refined. It came in bars made of animal fat, salt and ash, coarse but effective. Soap was regional, and that meant it was political. In fact, by the 13th and 14th centuries, soap making had become an industry, with city guilds forming in places like Marseille, Nablus, and York. Guild soap was expensive, so while nobles and monasteries used it generously, peasants relied on home brews, mixtures of ashes, lye, stale urine, and when lucky, herbs like soapwort or oxgall. Soapwort was a small, unassuming plant with foamy leaves when crushed. If boiled into a decoction, it worked as a gentle cleanser. Midwives sometimes used it to wash newborns. Laundresses prized it when they could find it growing in the hedgerows. In some regions, certain households became known for soap making. Recipes were handed down through generations, often guarded like secret spells, and sometimes soap was used for more than fabric. Some women rubbed it on their hands before washing to protect the skin from harsh lye. Others mixed it with crushed herbs to scent cloth for market days. For wealthier households, the ritual of washing became performative. Linens were starched with flour paste, collars were pressed with heated stones or glass balls rolled across cloth. Fine garments were aired on lavender branches or sewn with sprigs of rosemary. But for most, laundry was still basic, routine, cyclical, and deeply communal. In villages, wash days brought women together. They gossiped, swapped remedies for stains and sickness, and monitored whose linens were whiter, whose tunics were patched, whose family might be struggling. Laundry was surveillance as much as sanitation. The condition of your clothing told a story. A stain that wouldn't lift might suggest moral laxity. A tunic left too long unwashed might imply neglect. A woman seen boiling lye without gloves was either proud or desperate. In cities, public washhouses served a similar function. They were loud, steamy, and sometimes scandalous. Stories abound of laundresses in Paris and Venice who used the opportunity to trade news, flirt, or settle scores with barbed words and wayward splashes. And then there were the laundry fines. Yes, some towns had actual fines for drying laundry in the wrong places. In 14th century London, it was illegal to hang wet linens across certain alleyways. In Florence, fines could be issued for beating clothes too loudly near churches. The act of washing, it seemed, touched every part of life. Labor, law, faith, pride, all soaked together in a bucket of wood ash and cold river water. But what happened to laundry when the Black Death swept through Europe? When entire households died and linens were left folded in cupboards? When the Black Death arrived in 1347, it didn't just bring suffering, it brought stains that no soap could lift. Blood, sweat, bile, the quiet rot of fever-drenched sheets, and laundry, so humble, so routine, so easily forgotten, suddenly became dangerous. Because cloth doesn't die, it holds memory, and in plague-ridden Europe, it held something worse, contagion. Let us pause in a silent house, sometime in 1348. The family is gone, the hearth has gone cold, but the linen remains. Bed sheets twisted in the shape of a final night's struggle, a camise stained yellow at the collar, a pillow still faintly warm. Neighbors don't rush in, because everyone knows the plague might be in the fabric. They speak of bad air, miasma, devil's breath. No one knows about bacteria, but they see patterns. Those who touch the linens get sick, so the unwashed sheets stay where they are. In some towns, civic ordinances are issued, burn the bedding, and burn it they did. Pyres were built outside city walls, filled not just with bodies, but with the soft remnants of the living, nightgowns, handkerchiefs, child-wrapped shawls, anything that smelled wrong, anything that clung to fever. This loss was quiet but profound, because for many, linen was inheritance. A bride brought embroidered sheets into marriage, a mother handed down swaddling cloths, a man's shroud might once have been his baptismal blanket. Burning laundry wasn't just a public health measure, it was the erasure of memory. And yet, some cloth survived. In monasteries, nuns worked tirelessly to cleanse and preserve. They boiled sheets for the sick, sometimes adding vinegar to the water, or herbs thought to fight infection. Lavender, sage, rue. They hung them high in cloisters, letting the sun bake what the lye could not kill. These women became some of the first medical laundresses in recorded history. They didn't just clean, they healed through linen. Their hands cracked, their lungs filled with smoke and steam, but they washed. In cities like Avignon, records show payments made to laundresses for removal of death-stained garments. They were paid little, but they were brave, and yet they were not always welcome. Some laundresses were banned from marketplaces, accused of carrying sickness. Others were forced to live outside city gates. To wash became both sacred and suspect, and still, cloth outlived the plague. In forgotten trunks buried beneath floorboards, or in abbey storerooms, some medieval linens slept undisturbed for centuries. A camise, buried in a grave beneath a chapel floor. A head wrap found deep in the archives of a Spanish convent, folded between hymnals. Modern textile historians, with their soft gloves and careful tweezers, now study these relics. They find stitch patterns unique to villages, plant residues that hint at lost soap recipes, laundered folds that align with the rhythm of medieval wash weeks. Sometimes, even strands of hair trapped in a thread remain. Each piece, a quiet witness. Each stain, a story. And all of it reminds us that even the dullest routines, washing, drying, folding, are part of our shared memory. Because laundry is what we leave behind, not our triumphs, not our songs, but the worn edges of a sleeve, the sun-bleached corner of a pillow, the ghost of a hem, repaired 3 times before its final wear. In the end, perhaps the strangest legacy of medieval laundry is this: it endured, through flood and famine, through war and fire, through plague and progress. Even now, somewhere in a museum drawer or monastery attic, a piece of linen waits, cleaned by hands, long buried, smoothed with care, and folded with the kind of reverence that made washing something more than survival. It made it sacred. So next time you toss your shirt into a washer and walk away, remember the women at the river, the fire-warmed buckets, the cracked knuckles and broken soap, and the fact that once upon a time, the act of cleaning your clothes took all week, all your strength, and just a little bit of faith.